Hello and welcome to the next iteration of this Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition Arcane Magic Guide. We're now up to level 4 spells. So levels 1 through 3 video is complete, and now here we are at level 4. And as usual, I'll give a quick introduction and then get into going through each of the spells in this spell level on a very detailed and stats analytics based perspective. First of all, thanks to everybody who's commented on the existing videos. Love the comments, giving me some interesting ideas for how to improve these videos, and I'll be hopefully putting a couple of those into this one, like putting the spell ratings in the timestamps and also increasing the text size when I record the video over the episode. So thanks to the people who suggested those tweaks. As a refresher, I'm going to look at each spell in the level going through in alphabetical order, and I'm going to talk about what the spell does, how strong it is, and run through a bunch of details on how the spell interacts with the rest of the game's rule set. I'm talking about these spells from a base game, so Enhanced Edition, no mods perspective. I typically play on insane difficulty and try to do deathless or as minimal deaths as possible runs. I usually play solo, although I'll talk about these spells from a party perspective as well. And I'll also mention SCS and the applicability of what I'm saying to SCS. That's the Sword Coast Stratagems mod from time to time. So these videos are still relevant for SCS players. And lastly, as usual, I'm going to take a pure power gaming perspective and talk about what I think makes your mages the optimal killing machines, putting much lower priority to no priority on things like role-playing and how fun something is, although I will talk about that as well. Just for me, this game is all about maximizing efficiencies, making your character as powerful as possible, and that's how I look at these spells. I'm going to rank the spells 1 through 10, and the rating system is back up here. Rating 1 is an exceptionally bad spell. Rating 10 is one of the few game-changing or game-breaking spells that represents a huge power spike when you first get it. And big question, could this level 4, be the first spell level where we see a rating 10 spell? TBD. Let's go through. There were none in levels 1 through 3, although there's some extremely strong spells in those levels. Let's see in level 4. So all that said, I guess I'll give a few words about level 4 spells as a group and the spell level's strength and dynamics as a whole. I feel like spell level 3 was a really complicated spell level with a few very strong spells that were difficult to assess against one another. And depending on your play style, your choices for level 3 spells might differ a lot. Whether it's you love Melfs because you like fighting mages versus whether you prefer to debuff using remove magic or using breach and single target spells, to whether you have a bunch of fighters and haste is very strong, or whether you're just trying to maximize damage through skull trap. And then on top of that, you had all these different new game mechanics. There's the first spell turning spell, there's the first resistances, there's remove and dispel magic. Level 3 is just very complicated with a lot of complex game dynamics introduced for the first time. And now we're on to level 4. Level 4 is sort of like a warm, fuzzy blanket compared to all that complexity in level 3. In level 4, I think it's a spell level that's very akin to level 2 arcane magic, where there's almost no damage dealing spells in the entire level. And there's some very strong buffs for your mages. And that's really what the spell level ends up revolving around. Just like in level 2, You can't really go wrong with mirror image and maybe a little bit of blur. In level 4, as we're going to see, there's a couple of buff spells that are clearly the best spells in the level. And then what you do in the level beyond that, is not super critical. Although, of course, we're still going to analyze everything very carefully. So this should be, I'm guessing, a bit shorter video than the level 3 spell guide. Just because fewer game dynamics are introduced here for the first time, and the choices are a bit clearer in level 4. It's also, I'll say, one of the weaker spell levels overall. Like especially if you look past the first, the absolute strongest spell in the level. Level 4 it's still a stronger spell level than level 2, but it's sort of similar. It might be one of the 2 or 3 weakest arcane spell levels. Level 3, once you adjust for the fact that spells should get stronger as you level up, of course. Level 3 was an unusually strong spell level with really, really strong spells that are strong throughout the saga. And level 4, aside from the top 2 or 4 spells, there's really not that much here that's useful throughout the entire saga. All right, let's get into the spells. The first spell we'll talk about here is Confusion. Confusion has a duration of 5 rounds plus 1 round for every 6 levels, a cast time of 4, and a saving throw negates. This spell causes confusion in 1 or more enemy creatures within the area, creating indecision and the inability to take effective action. All enemy creatures within the area of effect are allowed saving throw versus spell with a -2 penalty. Those successfully saving are unaffected by the spell, whereas those who fail their saving throws will either go berserk, stand confused, or wander about for the duration of the spell. Wandering creatures move as far away from the caster as possible according to their most typical mode of movement. Any confused creature that is attacked perceives the attacker as an enemy and acts according to its basic nature. The spell lasts for 5 rounds plus 1 round every 6 levels of the caster. So here is another example of one of those saving throw negates crowd control spells that, as I keep saying, there's so many of in this game, and this is yet another one. I think Confusion stands out because it's one that enemy mages love to cast against your party. Confusion is one of the first spells that many tough mages in BG1 and also mages in BG2 will attempt to cast against your party. So everyone's familiar with this spell and the need oftentimes to protect yourself with things like chaotic commands to avoid getting CC'd by a confusion spell. And this is another one of those spells that it seems extremely deadly when used against you or your party because chaos ensues. But for a variety of reasons I'll get into, when I use it, or when considering this spell as versus other choices, or something that whether you should take it as the player character or in your party, it's a very different perspective. So I'll get into why and why I think this is one of the most overrated spells in the game, along with Chaos at level 5, which I also think is overrated, but it is much better than this spell. So let's break down what this does. So again, it's a saving throw negates crowd control spell, although you do get a -2 bonus to your likelihood to hit. So that's about a 10% chance in most instances, considering saves are a d20. And to check against save or spell, as most of these saving throw negates spells are in the Arcane book. The spell is party friendly in AoE. That's always good. It's rare to find that, or maybe a minority of these crowd control spells have that dynamic. So that's probably the best thing that can be said for this spell. But let's talk about what the actual effect is, assuming that enemies do fail their saves. I find overall that the effects are not very predictable, and because of the specifics of how this is coded into the game, and oftentimes don't accomplish what you want to do, which is to control and distract enemies and prevent them from hurting your party. The spell description says that enemies, if they fail their save, will either go berserk, stand confused, or wander about. But the way this actually seems to be coded into the game, what I always seem to see is that first, the affected creature will keep attacking whatever is nearest for a few rounds. Then it'll wander around, and then it'll stand. And I think at least when enemies are standing, they will fight back oftentimes if you do attack them. So I think the most important aspect of this is that affected creatures, when they're first hit by this spell, they will continue to attack for a few rounds, and most times they're going to continue to attack you as, you know, the caster of this or somebody on your party, because the enemy was closest to that unit at the time that the spell procced. In addition, if enemy spellcasters fail their save versus this spell, they'll continue to cast out whatever they were in the process of casting when the spell hit them. So if an enemy mage is in the middle of casting a really nasty spell against your party, and you hit that mage with a confusion, and if you're lucky enough to have the enemy mage fail his save, then the enemy mage is not going to be affected at all with respect to that spell that the mage is casting at that moment. No problem. Spell is going to continue to be cast, and whatever nasty thing was going to happen is going to happen to your party. So, you know, I think the biggest thing to point out here is, given the first phase is this berserk phase where the creature still attacks, and this is a short duration spell overall, there's many scenarios where for about a third of the time of this entire duration, if the enemy fails their save versus confusion, the enemy is just going to keep doing exactly what you didn't want the enemy to do. Especially when you consider that fighters are likely to have lower save or worse saves versus spell, and so this fighters would be, you know, stupid fighters that have bad saves would be the best target for this type of crowd control. But at least for the first few rounds after this thing goes off, if you do make it, those fighters are just going to keep wailing away against your party, and it's only after a couple rounds of doing so that the fighters start to wander around and the spell actually has an effect. So I just, you know, in theory this spell is good, but in practice, what are we really doing here? Like, this is a crowd control spell that, even if it's successful, even if enemies fail their save, it doesn't actually do anything for a few rounds. It's like a delayed crowd control spell. Is that even a crowd control spell? You know, over a multi-round fight, yes, this definitely will help you when enemies start wandering around. But if there are enemies that you're really worried about, you could get shredded by those enemies in the few rounds when they're, quote, berserk and continue to attack you. And this is a level 4 spell. You know, we got to compare it to the alternatives and other crowd control spells that are available. You could look at the -2 saves penalty and say, well, that's pretty decent. But remember, we had Web all the way back in level 2, a much worse spell level where there's less competition for slots. And that's also AoE. That spell has 10 separate chances to stun enemies, which is an effect that takes effect immediately. You know, it's going to take enemies immediately out of the fight. It's going to interrupt their casting. It's going to make every attack that you make against those enemies hit. And you have 10 separate chances to do that over the life of a web spell. Web is also AoE. The only difference is that web is not party friendly. But, you know, if you're being smart, if you're using free action, if you're using minor globe of invulnerability, you know, there's many ways to fight inside a web and not have it affect your party. So I think at the end of the day, when you compare Confusion, which oftentimes has no effect for the first couple rounds, even if enemies fail their save, to the level 2 Web spell, Web is still better in my book. It's still a better spell. And this is 2 spell slots higher. I think the last thing to say about Confusion is that I think this is another spell. It's a lot like Lightning Bolt in level 3, where like chaos favors the game engine versus you as the player or the party. You never want to die. You have to kill thousands of enemies or hundreds of enemies and not die. And the game only needs one thing to go wacky, and that's enough to kill you. So the game favors chaos, right? And characters running around, potentially attacking their party members, standing in place, doing unpredictable things. That is very scary when it's the enemy, when it's the world or enemies doing it to your party. But when it's you doing it to the world, you need more predictability in a good crowd control spell. Overall, the AoE and party-friendly dynamics plus the save, the -2 penalty make this a decent crowd control spell, but I don't think this is better than Slow, which has an immediate positive effect for you and helps you hit enemies and is also party-friendly in AoE. I don't think this is better than Web, that also has the same saves penalty as AoE and has a much nastier effect on enemies. And this spell's higher level. So I think overall, this is one of the most overrated spells in the game. And I think one other thing I have in my notes here to mention is just the fact that by the time you get to mid BG2 or TOB, almost every enemy that's a nasty enemy, well, first of all, everyone has super low saves. So if your strategy depends on enemies failing their saves, you're going to have a tough time. But second, many enemies are simply immune to Confusion once you get later in the game. So outside of BG1 and like early BG2, this spell just becomes extremely unpredictable because there's so many enemies that are immune to it. And that's another reason, that lack of scalability is another reason why this is not a great spell. Not totally garbage. Not one of the worst CC spells in the game, but I think really overrated and just an okay spell that I would deprioritize over other options. So I rate this a 3 out of 10 for Confusion. Next up, not to be confused with Confusion, is Contagion. Contagion is a necromancy spell with a permanent duration, a saving throw negates, and it has a casting time of 4. This spell causes a major disease and weakness in a creature. The afflicted individual is immediately stricken with painful and distracting symptoms: boils, blotches, lesions, seeping abscesses, and so on. Strength, dexterity, and charisma scores are reduced by 2. The afflicted character is also slowed. These effects persist until the character receives a cure disease spell. I have written here in my notes, LOL. Okay, this is a bad spell. It's a single target, saving throw negates it, and what does it actually do? So you do slow the afflicted character, but let's compare that to the other means that you have to slow enemies. The level 3 spell Slow is an AoE slow with a -4 saves bonus. So why would you ever, if you're trying to slow enemies, which is by far the worst debuff that this spell Contagion places on enemies, then you would always just choose the level 3 spell AoE slow. You would never use this. The other effect, to reduce strength, dexterity, and charisma by 2, extremely weak, extremely marginal negative impacts on enemies. The strength and dexterity effects may reduce damage output, AC and THAC0 by 1 to 3 points, but that's very marginal, hardly a disable. Of course, the charisma penalty, I think, is more of like a role-playing thing, has actually 0 impact on enemies that you might face in the game. Only your own charisma matters, not like a Gibberling's charisma or some enemy human's charisma has no relevance to anything. Also, by the way, you would think that if somebody's diseased with painful and distracting boils, blotches, lesions, and seeping abscesses, that should be worth more than 2 charisma points, by the way. Like, that seems like that person would be horrible to be around. In any event, this is a bad spell. Yet another single target crowd control spell. It's garbage. This one stands out as especially bad considering that the only real debuff here is the slow effect, but you have a level 3 spell that does that and is better in every single way. Never take Contagion. Really bad spell. 1 out of 10. Next up, we have Dimension Door. Made famous by the first enemy that uses it, and really the only enemy that uses it, Deveorn at the bottom of the Cloakwood Mines in BG1. The casting time is 1, so very quick. This spell transports the caster to any place within the visual range of the caster. I can really stop there. That's what it does. It's a teleport spell. So I'll just talk about the dynamics of this spell for a minute. So I've thought of lots of different ways to potentially use this spell to do cheesy things, but none of them really work. For example, you can't combo this with Farsight or sending a party member across the map or sending your familiar across the map to teleport your mage across the entire map. The distance that you can teleport is limited to the mage's own line of sight. So it really can only teleport you, whatever that is in game distance, 30 feet or whatever. Not very far at all, which, sort of eliminates the ability to use this for cheese. If you try to do that, if you try to cast it across the map, then you have to be careful because the mage will simply walk to the point where whatever you selected is in vision, and then try to teleport across. So that's obviously not what you want, is your mage wandering across the battlefield or across a dungeon level. And because of that limitation, this spell does not allow you to go around doors, because all of the hard locked, important doors in this game that you might really want to bypass to save yourself time and can't be bashed down or opened with knock, they all prohibit vision past the door. So there's no way to cast Dimension Door to go through those doors. So you can't use this to fly across the entire map. You can't use it to get through doors. I can't really think of any important door that this allows you to get through. And really what that means is this is just about being able to instantly teleport within the field of battle. And given that, it's really hard to see how this spell is worth a level 4 spell slot. I think the only situation where I've been glad that I have this spell memorized is, late in the game when you have improved alacrity, you have Vecna, and you're using Wish in battle to refresh your spell slots live in battle. There have been situations where my mage has been stuck between maybe a bunch of Jinn from the Wish spell or against a wall plus 3 or 4 enemies all around the mage. And I knew that my spell protections wouldn't be up for long enough, for it's just a bad situation. In those situations, I actually have before stocked a Dimension Door during the fight, used Wish to rest during the fight, get the spell slot, and then use Dimension Door to teleport out of that sticky situation, all within the round or within the same improved alacrity. So there is a use for this. It's sort of like an oh crap button, but that really only becomes relevant super late game when you have your full arsenal available, including lots of wishes and improved alacrity. And even at that stage, I'm not stocking this spell as I'm going into fights over other level 4 spell slots. But that is, a real world example of where this spell has saved my ass before. I think also there is, when you're in very, very late game, you can sort of use this for fun to, use Vecna, Farsight, and so you can see the whole battlefield and improved alacrity and, just teleport around the battlefield, smiting enemies. It's pretty fun. But that's, more for fun, less power gaming. You could just run over with improved haste and boots of speed and do the same thing probably about as fast. And you'll run out of dimension doors pretty quickly, obviously, if each one is taking up a level 4 spell slot. In summary, a spell that you'd think there would be a lot of cheesy ways to use, there's really not. But it does do something that no other spell in the game can do. There's no other spell in the game that can allow your mage to, or any other character for that matter. There's no equivalent in divine magics. There's no other spell that can allow a character to teleport exactly where you want, other than this one. So it does have limited uses. I'll give this spell, Dimension Door, a 3 out of 10 rating. Next spell in level 4 is Emotion Hopelessness. This spell has a duration of 9 rounds, plus 1 round per level after the 7th level, a cast time of 4, and saving throw says special. I'm not sure why it says special. It's a save versus spell. I'll read the description. When this spell is cast, the wizard can disturb the emotional state of those around her. The effect of this is to inflict a feeling of hopelessness upon the enemies within the visual range of the caster. Upon a failed saving throw versus spell, the affected creature will lie down where they stand and give over all their will to a higher power. Sometimes they can be heard to exclaim things such as, "I lay down and die," or "I'm going home." That never happens in game dialogue. I wish it did. This will last for the duration of the spell, upon which they will return to normal. The secondary effect of this spell is to instill upon the caster the feeling of courage. This will remove any effects of panic and restore her morale, as well as prevent the above from creeping forth into her psyche. There is no saving throw versus this, and it will last for the duration of the spell. It will, however, be affected by magic resistance and other such things. So, this is sort of a strange combo of a couple of effects. The first is that it puts enemies to sleep. It's the same effect as sleep. Enemies go unconscious for this quite long duration, 9 rounds plus 1 round per level. And then if they fail their saving throw versus spell. And then the other effect is that regardless whether this actually affects any enemies or hits any enemies, and regardless whether they save, the caster only, not the rest of the party, but the caster only comes under the effect of Resist Fear, which is like the level 2 pre-spell, which will prevent being feared and also remove any fear that the caster may be under the effect of. So it's sort of a mishmash of 2 different effects into a level 4 spell, and it's also single target on enemies. I'm sorry. No, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is actually AoE. I correct myself. This is AoE, a 15-foot radius around the caster. So it is AoE. So, I think if you look at these 2 effects, the AoE effect is better than level 1 sleep spell because it does affect higher hit dice enemies, although higher hit dice enemies are highly likely to save versus spell, or be immune to this type of effect. And then the effect on the caster, the remove fear effect, I can't really think of an instance where that's helpful, because if you're feared, you're not going to be able to control yourself to cast the spell. So it would have to be preventative. But if you're worried about going into a fight where an enemy mage might cast horror, or you might be feared, then you really don't want to take your chances of waiting until the fight starts to cast emotion, hopelessness, and thereby protect only your mage from the fear effect. I mean, of course, the other reason not to do it through this spell is that resist fear or remove fear are AoE effects or AoE buffs for your party, whereas this only affects the mage. So not a very useful buff. And the disable on enemies is decent, but it's just yet another, if you save versus spell, you avoid the effect, and there's 0 bonus here. So overall, we have here a combination of a weaker version of remove or resist fear that's almost never going to be helpful to you and not how you would choose to apply those buffs, plus a save versus spell disable that is party friendly and AoE, but there's no saves bonus. So it's still hard to justify this level 4 crowd control spell against things like slow or web that are available at lower levels and have comparably devastating effects on enemies, certainly for the web spell, which stuns enemies, and come with a save versus spell bonus that this spell lacks. It's not a horrible spell. I struggle between rating it a 2 or a 3 out of 10. But there are enough enemies that are immune to this type of sleep effect. And the crowd control aspect compares unfavorably enough to lower level spells like web that I think this is a 2 out of 10 in my book. I'm just never taking this over other level 4 spells that are gonna have better effects. Even if I wanted a party friendly AoE crowd control spell, I would probably choose Confusion over this spell, just because at least Confusion comes with a -2 saves penalty. So 2 out of 10 for Emotion Hopelessness, although one of the better bad spells, I guess, at rating 2. Next up is Enchanted Weapon. Enchanted Weapon has a duration of 5 rounds per level, so quite a long time. An area of effect of 1 creature, no save. When this spell is cast on a creature, it enchants any weapons that it currently wields. For the duration of the spell, those weapons are treated as having a +3 enchantment for the purposes of determining what they can hit. So this buff, it affects 1 party member or the caster. You can choose who to cast it on. And the only effect of the spell is to enable that party member's weapons to hit enemies that have immunity to +1 and +2 weapons. This is the only purpose of this spell. This spell does not actually give you the damage or THAC0 bonuses that usually go along with having a +3 weapon. That's a very limited use case. I'm not really sure of any enemies in the entire game that have a +3 requirement to hit them before +3 weapons are widely available, like once you get to BG2. I guess if you're playing Siege of Dragonspear, Belafet does have this, the final boss does have this this quality that you need +3 or better weapons to hit Belafet. That's really the only example that I can think of. By the time you get to BG2, there are a variety of enemies that have these sort of requirement to hit thresholds. I honestly can't think of any off the top of my head where +3 is the difference maker versus like Kangax's Demi-Lich form, you need +5 weapons to hit. I'm not sure what enemies, even in BG2, you need +3 weapons to hit. The reason for that is probably just that +3 weapons are so widely available in BG2 right from the beginning of the game that I've never not had +3 weapons very early in SOA. So I guess that just speaks to the uselessness of this spell. The only example in the entire saga I can think of where you need +3 weapons and it's before BG2 would be Belafet, as mentioned. But even by that time, you have a lot of access to +3 weapons, enough to not need this spell. You have a +3 staff that you can buy in Olgoth's Beard from level 1 in BG1. You have a +3 staff that you can win on the bridge heading into the elevator to fight Belafet in SOD. Drizd's weapons are +3. There's the +3 two-handed sword that's available in Durlag's Tower. So you have many +3 weapons available in BG1 before you would even get to the only enemy I can think of pre SOA that you need +3 enchantment for. So I just can't think of a use case for this spell. It seems like it was created to avoid a roadblock for your party if you potentially meet an enemy that has this level of protection, but I just don't know that one exists. And another note is that even if you did have an enemy that you were concerned about hitting because you needed +3 weapons to do so and you didn't have enough for your party, but you had a bunch of arcane casters, I think the solution for that would be Melf's Minute Meteors, which strike as +5 or +6 and actually do provide the Thaco bonus associated with that. So, if you hit that type of enemy, I think you're much better off having your arcane casters cast Melf's Minute Meteors and having the fighters, etc. in your party just use the many +3 weapons that you should have by the end of BG1. Overall, a very weak spell designed to address one specific type of enemy that doesn't really exist and becomes completely obsolete by the time you get to BG2. This is a very bad spell. 1 out of 10 for Enchanted Weapon. Next up is Farsight. Farsight has a duration of 3 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 4. And when Farsight is cast, the caster is able to view an area of an unexplored map. After casting the spell, simply click on a section of the map that you want to view. For the duration of the spell, the caster can spy on that area, noting creatures and fortifications. So, what does this do? When you cast the spell, it'll bring up the map screen and you can select an area on the map, and this spell will reveal an AoE. It'll reveal a circle on the map that's equal to the vision distance as if you were standing in the middle of that circle. And you'll just be able to see that part of the map for as long as the spell lasts, regardless whether you or anybody else in your party is inside or near the circle. There's really only 2 spells in the game that will let you see areas where you don't have a party member or you're familiar. There's this, and they're both in level 4. There's this spell, Farsight, which is in the Divine and Arcane magic books, and then there's Wizard Eye, which is only an arcane spell that we'll get to later in this level. So those are the 3 spells that give you this ability to see outside your party's normal field of vision. Otherwise, summons that you may cast, you really can't. You have difficulty sending them off to fight by themselves because your vision doesn't travel with summons. You would need Farsight or to use a Wizard Eye to send your summons into battle. That goes as well for things like Project Image and Simulacrum. You need vision to use those images or simulacrums outside of your own regular field of vision. So now the solution, to do very cheesy things with summons and with project images and simulacrums is going to be Farsight or Wizard Eye. Because really, by the time you have access to those spells, you don't want to send your familiar in. You don't even want to take your familiar out of its pack, really. There's too much risk that your familiar would die through some stray AoE or whatever. So that's what this spell does. It's about vision. And naturally, given that you have Wizard Eye at the same level, I think one way to assess Farsight is to really compare it to the Wizard Eye spell. So if you compare the two, Farsight has a longer duration than Wizard Eye. And I think overall, the dynamics of Farsight make it a stronger spell. I'll get into the weaknesses of Wizard Eye when I talk more about that spell later, but Wizard Eye will end when the eye is killed or dispelled. And that happens a lot because the Wizard Eye is very weak and lots of things can kill it. Farsight, of course, it's just a spell. There's no unit associated with it, and it's going to last for the full duration regardless of what's happening on the battlefield. So although the Wizard Eye can move around and reveal different areas of the map at different times, overall, I think in my experience, I find Farsight more reliable for revealing other areas of the map just because of the fragility of the Wizard Eye. And as to the use of this spell, it's not really going to be possible to reveal an entire dungeon through Farsight, given the small area that it reveals. Where I really use this spell a lot is for specific, very difficult fights that occur over a larger area, or where I want to send in summons to deal with the fight because it's too scary. Some examples of that are in the beholder areas. There's a few areas where the beholders will congregate, and I'll cast a Farsight so I can send a Planetar in there to kill the beholders, because otherwise anti-magic ray is impossible to deal with as an arcane magic user. That's an example. Any big ball spite fight later on in the game, those fights always tend to take place over these big epic battlefields that are much bigger than party line of sight. That's true for Yagashura, it's true for the Balthazar fight, it's especially true for the final fight up, in the platforms where you're fighting a Malison. Those platform areas are much bigger than your party's line of sight will normally be. And I find it to be super helpful in these complex, long fights to have vision of the entire battlefield at all times through Farsight to see where enemies are, whether they're incapacitated, what they're casting, whether they're dispelled or they have their buffs up. Like, all that stuff is super important as you're making decisions as to who to target, what spells to interrupt, and what the greatest threat is at any given time. I just find that it's really, really helpful to have Farsight up covering the entire battlefield in some of those longer, trickier fights in the entire game. And it is possible to do that when you're using Wish to refresh your vision in fight, throwing up 4 or 5 Farsights over the course of a battle when you're in improved alacrity. This is instant cast with Vecna, is very possible. So that's something that I always do in these tricky fights, and I find it to be super helpful. This is a good example of cleric mage synergies because the divine level 4 is a weak spell level. So if you're a cleric mage at high levels, especially if you have an XP cap remover, then there's no reason not to take several Farsights in your cleric book, not use a valuable arcane slot for it at level 4, and use that instead of your mage book to illuminate the battlefield. But even for a pure mage, this is still a helpful spell to have, I think. So in summary, I do find this more helpful than Wizard Eyes, which I can never seem to keep alive. I'll get more into that later. I think it makes a lot of the absolute worst, trickiest, longest fights in the game much easier. You know, once you do it once where you reveal the whole battlefield, it's sort of hard to go back to imperfect information of not knowing what your enemies are doing or whether they're summoning creatures, etc. I find that that's very useful. So there's a specific use case for these big battles, but there's no spell in the game that replaces what Farsight does in those battles, and I find it to be pretty useful. You know, especially if you're somebody that likes the strategic aspect of those long fights where you have to pay attention to what enemies are doing and decide who you're going to try to interrupt or who the biggest threat is. I thought about the rating here a lot. I do think this is a very underrated spell, given its use in these big battles, and I'll rate it a 5 out of 10. A pretty good spell that has situational uses. I think I rate it a little bit higher because the situational uses are best in some of the hardest fights in the entire game. So 5 out of 10 rating for Farsight. Next up are Fire Shield Blue, and I'm going to combine it with Fire Shield Red and talk about both spells at the same time because they're so similar. I'll rate them separately because I do think they have different merits, but I'll talk about them both at the same time. So I'll read the Fire Shield Blue description and then talk about how Red is different. Fire Shield Blue has a duration of 3 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 4. The AoE is just the caster, and there's no save given this is a buff. The blue Fire Shield protects the user from cold damage by surrounding the caster with a shield of ice flame. This shield not only grants the user 50% cold resistance, but also protects the caster from attacks made within a 5-foot radius around the caster. An opponent that hits the caster with any weapons or spells within this radius suffers 1d8 plus 2 cold damage. Now, Fire Shield Red is the exact same spell, except it grants 50% fire resistance, and when enemies hit the caster within that same 5-foot radius under a Fire Shield Red, the enemies take 1d8 plus 2 fire damage instead of cold damage. So you have one that protects against cold and does cold damage, and one that protects against fire and does fire damage. This is a spell that you're going to see a lot of in Baldur's Gate because enemy mages, especially in the base game, they love this. They cast this all the time. It seems like every lich, every high-level caster, all the way through BG2 just loves throwing up this spell. You would think that this is like one of the best buffs or spells in the entire game, just based on how often enemy mages in the base game cast it on themselves. Of course, as we're learning as we go through these spells, you know, whether spells are included in the Mage AI in the base game is not really a good signal of whether the spells are good or not. You know, maybe the developers just thought, hey, this spell looks pretty damn cool with its wall of fire, so we're going to have enemy mages use this all the time. Because as I'll get into, these spells are just okay. They're not super great spells. So I think the first thing to get into detail on with these spells is what procs it, like what causes the Fire Shield to actually do the 1d8 plus 2 points of damage to an enemy. First, getting hit by a physical attack, but within 5 feet, which is melee range, so very tight. You know, ranged attacks, this isn't going to do anything against ranged attackers. Also, if enemies miss their physical attack, this spell is not going to do anything. You know, it's not like you can have super low AC and go into battle and have enemies kill themselves by whiffing at you. They have to actually be hitting you. That said, there is a nice synergy with Mirror Image or Stoneskin because, you know, if a physical attack, the attack roll is made, that counts as a hit, but the Mirror Image or Stoneskin protects you from the physical damage associated with that hit, you still will successfully harm the enemy that attacked you through the fire shield, right? So you can go into fights buffed up with Stoneskin and Mirror Image and get hit and take no damage and have the fire shield hurt your enemy attacker. The spell description also says that any spells, quote, any spells will proc the damage. And I was very skeptical that this could be true initially, because I wasn't sure if there was something coded into the game mechanics that allows you to sense, who's casting a spell against you within a certain radius. But it's true. This is actually coded in. Any spell appears to proc the damage. If your magic resistance resists the spell, just as if a physical attack was missed against you, then the damage doesn't proc. If you save versus a spell, then it doesn't proc. But otherwise, spells that actually do affect you seem to proc the shield, regardless what they are, whether they're damage or not, and also whether they're AoE damage or not. So I'll give an example. Like if an enemy divine caster casts Doom, which is a debuff, a saves debuff against you, and that enemy caster is within a 5-foot radius, the fire shield is gonna hit that enemy caster for 1d8 plus 2 points of the elemental damage when the Doom goes off. So it's a non-damage effect, but the fire shield still is gonna do the 1d8 plus 2 to the enemy. The same is true for AoE damage spells. If an enemy mage happens to be standing 5 feet from you and casts a skull trap at you, then your fire shield is gonna ping that caster. Magic missile, by the way, only counts as one times a single attack for purposes of proccing the shield, right? You don't get to do 1d8 plus 2 to an enemy mage that casts magic missile against you for each missile. It's just one per instance of the entire spell. Now, these are all super in the weeds detail about how the shield procs. These things aren't super relevant. You're very rarely going to have enemies casting magic at you from point blank range. Perhaps if you're a fighter mage, but generally enemy mages are going to be running away from you and casting things at you from range, i.e. outside the 5-foot radius of the spell. But that run through of the rule set was just to give the results of my research, and I think it does play somewhat into the strength of the spell. It's pretty nice that the fire shields will proc upon a variety of spells being cast against you, not just single target damage. To summarize, what do we really get through casting a fire shield? So you get these two things, right? You get resistance, and then you get this 1d8 plus 2 points of elemental damage, either fire or cold. So I'll talk about each of those in turn. First, 50% resistance to either fire or cold. I think that in itself is not super useful. Only a 50% resistance. If you're playing on very high difficulties, then the remaining damage, even if you reduce it by 50% from some of the nastiest, elemental spells against you, is still very high, and that remaining 50% will still interrupt your casting. Maybe you favor using the fire shields if you are trying to fill a gap on top of an item to get to 100%. But even if you're in that scenario, then protection from elements at level 7 will get you cold, electricity, and fire resistance, and all at 75%. So if you're close with items, then that's probably a better choice for you than trying to rely on one of the shields. And I think if your focus is to get to acceptable resistances solely via using spells, then you're much better off using the level 3 resist spells that have much longer durations and give 100% resistance to either fire or cold. The big one is fire resistance, because that damage type is so much more common. And, in my view, fire resistance or fire damage is so common in the game that you're going to want to be using the level 3 protection from fire spell, or protection from the elements plus an item to make sure that you have at least 100% fire resistance at all times. And there's not really a spot for this incremental 50% fire resistance from the fire shield over a much shorter duration to be very helpful to you. So yeah, the 50% elemental resistance is something, but 50% is an awkward number considering that your goal is really to be at 100% for long durations. Of course, the fire resistance is much better than the cold resistance in this respect. So that's the resistance. It's a nice buff, but nothing to write home about. The other aspect of the spell, of course, is the damage dealing properties, which we were just discussing earlier, the retaliation against enemies who hit you with the spell or with an attack. And on this front, the cold shield, the fire shield blue, I think is much, much better just because, as we've discussed before, so many enemies in this game are immune to fire, especially once you get to late SOA or TOB. So many enemies are completely immune to fire. All demons, the fire giants, any magic user will have resistance to fire or protection from the elements or light things up. So, fire damage late in the game is very rarely useful. And that takes a lot away from the scalability of this spell. It means that the cold damage is much more useful. So the fire shield blue is a little bit better than the red in this respect. I think the bigger picture problem with this 1d8 plus 2 damage is that if you're an arcane caster and enemies are able to actually walk up to you and get off a lot of APR that are hitting, so you're actually doing a meaningful amount of retaliation damage, then you're really not playing your mage right, and you're probably going to die. As a mage, you do not want to be sitting there repeatedly getting hit with physical attacks and just waiting for your mirror image and Stoneskin to wear off and die because you have few hit points. You need to be running away from enemies. You need to be stunning or killing enemies with ranged attacks or ranged magic before they get close to you. You don't want to be in a scenario where you're taking a ton of hits and you're relying on this chip damage from Fire Shield to protect you in some way. 1d8 plus 2 is just not that much compared to the massive damage that enemies will do against you if they're repeatedly hitting you with melee attacks. All that said, there is a much greater use case for this spell if you're a fighter mage and you plan to be in battle, using mirror images and Stoneskins, and you have enough HP and enough armor class to hold your own in battle, and you want a little bit of extra damage. The fire shields are a much better spell for a fighter mage than for a pure mage that doesn't want to ever be in melee. At the end of the day, this spell, both of the fire shields, they're not bad spells. They're hard to justify against things like Stoneskin or improved invisibility, or those two great buffs at this level, which we'll get to later. It's hard to justify them. They sort of give you a little bit of resistances instead of the 100% over a long duration that you want, and they give you a little bit of incremental damage, which is most helpful in scenarios where you don't want to be fighting in melee as a mage. So I think these spells are just okay. I find myself rarely taking them, and instead wanting to stock Stoneskins because protecting yourself completely from physical damage is much more important than doing a little bit of counter chip damage when you are hit. I'll give these spells a rating of 3 out of 10 for Fire Shield Red and 4 out of 10 for Fire Shield Blue, just considering that the ice damage or the cold damage on the blue Fire Shield is very likely to actually hit enemies, whereas the fire damage is usually resisted, negating at higher levels, negating any impact of this spell on your enemies if you're using the red version. So 3 out of 10 for the red Fire Shield and 4 out of 10 for Fire Shield Blue. Okay, next level 4 spell is Greater Malison. Greater Malison is an enchantment / charm spell. It has a duration of 2 rounds per level, a 50-foot range, a 15-foot radius, and a cast time of 4. And there's no saving throw because this is a saving throw debuffing spell. Wouldn't really make sense for it to have a saving throw attached to it in the first place. This spell allows the caster to adversely affect all the saving throws of her enemies. The effect is applied to all hostile creatures within the area of effect. Opponents under the influence of this spell make all saving throws at a penalty of -4. Okay, this is another one of those spells like maybe Melf's Minute Meteors, Confusion, spells that I think I'd put in the camp of controversial spells, or at least spells that I hear other people who played this game a lot saying are awesome spells, but I have some serious doubts and think are really not so great spells. So we'll get into why I think Malison is not really all that great. And to do that, we have to get pretty deep into the math and sort of look at the specific numbers before we can draw a conclusion. So first, let's just talk about what this spell actually does. It's party friendly and it's AoE. Those are always good things to have. And it's also worth noting that there's no real substitute in arcane magic to lower saving throws. Divine magic users have Doom, or if you're playing with the Icewind Dale spells, divine magic users also have Curse for area of effect saving throw debuffs. But for mages, this is the one spell to debuff enemy saves. And it is the most powerful enemy save debuff in the game, considering the AoE, the party friendliness, and the -4 impact. So there's really no substitute. If you think that debuffing enemy saves is powerful and worth a spell round on one of your arcane casters, then this would definitely be the spell to use. And it's not like there's anything better in the arcane spellbook. Okay, so those are the reasons that this spell seems very good, and why it's worth taking a close look at minimum. And to be clear, I do think this is a good spell. It's just a question of how good, and is it really one of the better level 4 spells, and in my view, should you be taking it, or when should you be taking it if you're power gaming with mages? So a penalty of -4. I think we have to go pretty deep into the rule set and look at some probabilities to assess how useful that really is. Recall, of course, saves are a D20 concept, but an important point is that saves can go to 1, 0, or negative, in which case the save is made automatically no matter what. So, this is not like attack rolls in the game where a 1 on the D20 will always be a critical miss and a 20 will always be a critical hit. Saves have no such limiters, and that makes a big difference. That means that sometimes for enemies that have saving throws of 1 or even negative once they're buffed up with items and spells, for those enemies will always make their saves, 100% of their saves, unless they're debuffed. So, that is an indicator that the value of this spell can be a lot higher in some situations versus others. And the other, even if it was just a straight D20, a -4 makes a much bigger difference in your odds to have an enemy fail a save if that enemy started at very low saves. Say, for example, that an enemy has a saving throw of 3. That means that a 3 or higher on a D20 will save. So only a 1 or a 2 will result in your spell succeeding. If you apply a -4 penalty, now that 3 becomes a 7. Now any roll of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 will cause the enemy to save, and you just tripled your likelihood of having your spell hit. That, if you think about the odds change tripling, that's pretty big. If you're going up against an enemy that was already 50-50 to save, then Malison's going to have a much smaller impact. So I put together some numbers, which I'm going to show here to just illustrate how strong Malison is, depending on what enemies you're facing. And, we can use this chart to go through and analyze really how strong is this spell. So let's look at the first section here. In this first section, I have two parts, and I'm going to have this for a few different sections in this Excel. I have a pre-Malison section and a post-Malison section. So the pre-Malison section is showing what the enemy's saving throw is prior to being debuffed through Greater Malison. So I give a range going from -5, which is like a very powerful enemy that has a bunch of buffs up, all the way up to 20. I'm not even sure if there is any enemy in the game that has a 20 saving throw. That would imply that the enemy has to roll a 20, otherwise they fail to save. But just for illustrative purposes, that's the highest possible to go, given this is a D20 concept. So this just shows like basically the realistic range of different enemies' saving throws pre being debuffed through Greater Malison. And I put some examples of enemies' base saving throws before buffs or debuffs along the left-hand side to give some context here for these numbers. So like very strong magic resistant enemies, and I'm using save versus spell here. I mean, generally speaking, save versus death will be a little bit higher. Save versus breath will be a little bit lower. I'm sorry. Save versus death will be a little bit lower, so enemies are more likely to make the save. And save versus breath will generally be a little bit higher, so it's harder for enemies to make the save versus spell. But save versus spell is a good proxy, and most spells in the Arcane book are a check versus on a save versus spell, so this is a good way to think about it. So some enemies that start with saving throw of 1, which means that they're always going to make their save 100% of the time. Saravok is an example when you face him at the end of BG1, or a Greater Mummy, a powerful, highly magic resistant, both in the sense of magic res and saves enemy. Other strong enemies that have saving throw of 5, so they make their saving throw or spell 80% of the time, are Deveorn and Beholders. Furkrag, Adelon, and Yagashura make their saves versus spell 75% of the time, or you have 25% chance to impact them with a spell that has save versus spell. Realtar, the mage that you face, just for a sense of a sort of like middling enemy, that's the mage who I think is Saravok's foster father, but Realtar, who you face in Candlekeep in BG1, has a saving throw of 10 base, so a 55% chance to save or a 45% chance to fail to save, and an Ankeg has a 13 saving throw. This is pretty versus spell. This is pretty common for low level enemies in BG1. They're generally going to have like 13, 14, 15 saving throws versus spell. So your spells are gonna succeed against them 60 to 70% of the time. All right, so this is pre-Malison, just for a sense of like what the state of play might be before you're casting this spell. All right, now let's look at post-Malison. So post-Malison, 4 has been added to all of these numbers. In other words, there's a +4 penalty to saving throws. That's the effect of Malison. And we can see here how your odds to hit have improved versus what the odds were previously. And I think about this in terms of a multiple on your odds to hit. So to take an example, for an enemy that started, a highly buffed up enemy that started at -5 to saving throws, they're going to make their save 100% of the time. Now they're going to be at -1. They're still making their save 100% of the time. Malison had no effect, right? Of course, that's highly buffed enemies that started with very low saving throws. If you go higher up, you see where Malison starts to have its greatest impact is where you had an enemy that was initially going to make 100% of their saves, and now the enemy is going to fail at least some percentage of their saves because they've been pushed from starting at 1 or lower into a saving throw roll that's now 5 at best, right? So in these scenarios, you improve your odds of hitting the enemy infinitely by casting Malison on them. Now, that said, you're still only at 20%, right? So, like, Malison was very powerful here in some sense, but even post-casting it, your spells are only going to succeed 1/5 of the time at having the enemy fail versus save. And then, the rest of the chart sort of proceeds from there. I think the thing that jumps out very strongly here is that once you start to get up to less powerful enemies, like especially, BG1, halfway through BG2 type enemies, average sorts of enemies, like Realtar, the Ankeg, once you're at enemies that have saves versus spell of 8 or higher to start, basically, you're not making a massive difference in your odds to hit them with your spell, or your odds for them to fail, right? You're increasing your odds by your odds of succeeding might be 1.5 times or 1.57 times or even less good versus pre-Malison. So you have to take that into account, right? The obvious point is that Malison has diminishing returns against weaker enemies. And intuitively it makes sense why debuff weaker enemies, but you see it in the numbers here. I mean, almost to the point where just even looking at this without any further analysis, you can see that unless you're fighting some pretty scary enemies that have quite low saves in the mid to low single digits, you're not going to get a ton of value from casting Malison if your spells after you cast it are only going to be 1.1 to 1.5 times as likely to hit. Okay, that's a general sense. Now let's think about this in a couple other ways that I think help to give some context to how good these odds multipliers really are. I think the important thing to consider is that, or the situation that I'm analyzing this spell through is you could always cast something else in the same round that you cast Malison, right? Malison in itself doesn't do anything bad to enemies. It's just a path along the road to incapacitating them or killing them. Just being debuffed to your saves has no relevance unless the enemy needs to save versus something. So I think one way to look at Malison is how does it compare to just casting another spell, like an offensive spell, a damage spell, for example, straight out of the Mage book and doing it twice instead of casting Malison and then casting the spell. Or even, casting more damage spells. So let's think about that, because you give up a round to cast this spell, and rounds of arcane magic casting in the thick of battle are extremely valuable. Notice I'm talking about pre-alacrity. Post-alacrity, you can dump your whole spell book. The analysis gets very different. I'll get to that later, especially because this spell has a 4 cast time, so you can get it off instantaneously with Vecna, and in a cast time of 3 with just Amulet of Power. But, I'll get to that later. Obviously, that's only like the very end of the game, late BG2 and TOB. So for the majority of the game, there's a real cost to casting this spell first, because you could have just been casting whatever you were trying to hit the enemy with in the first place. So let's first examine this from the perspective of considering that you're giving up a damage spell. And here I took the example of a Skull Trap, because Skull Trap at level 10, because Skull Trap is a pretty common and good damage spell, and it also has the most common save mechanic for a damage spell, which is that enemies will save versus spell for half damage. That's true of Fireball, Skull Trap, Lightning Bolt, Abby Dalzims. It's true for many different big bad damage spells. So let's take an example here. You're a level 10 mage and you're casting Skull Trap on your enemies. So if enemies make their save here, that level 10 Skull Trap, it does 1d6 per level. So you're talking about 10d6 or 3.5 expected damage per dice roll. And with 10 dice, that means that if the enemy fails the save, you're going to expect to do 35 damage. That's sort of the average outcome is 35 damage if enemies fail save. If they make their save, the average outcome is 17.5. 17.5 points of damage. So we can take these numbers and average them based on the odds of saving to come up with what the expected damage is, taking into account the enemy's likelihood to save. And that's what I'm showing here in the pre-Malison state in this column E here. What I'm showing is that for enemies who always make their save versus spell, like Sarevok as an example, you're always going to do 17.5 expected damage because the enemy is going to save every time. You don't have a shot of creeping up towards 35. On the flip side, an enemy with the worst conceivable save versus spell, a 20 that only saves 5% of the time, you're going to do 34.13 expected damage through your level 10 Skull Trap. So, this just gives you the pre-Malison state of the world. And it's sort of cool to see how impactful having low save versus spell really is. It's sort of worth, it's worth, even if you're getting down to 5 or 6 save versus spell, you're saving yourself like 13 points of expected damage per Skull Trap. So there's value there, right? But this is just the pre-Malison state of the world. All right. This is why saves are important, even versus damage spells. Now let's look post-Malison, okay? Post-Malison, all these saving throws are going to adjust up higher by 4. So your expected damage is going to increase for basically anybody that you would be casting this against, right? It only doesn't increase where you're at -3 or lower, where adding 4 still leaves with 100% save chance. So you're still at 17.5. Otherwise, you're going to see some improvement here. And how much improvement do you see? Well, if you cast Malison, because of the change in saves, on average, you're going to do an additional 3.5 damage per Skull Trap that you cast. That's it, 3.5. Because the change in save odds is not massive. And to begin with, the difference between saving and not saving is just 50%, not 100%, or avoiding the effect entirely. So when you look through all the math, the expected difference in your level 10 Skull Trap post Malison on an enemy and pre is 3.5 points of damage only. And another way to think about that is that you would have to cast a very high number of Skull Traps to have the Malison be worthwhile, right? If the Malison only improves your damage by 3.5, why didn't you just cast 2 Skull Traps? Or even more precisely, that number needs to be way higher for the Malison to be the better choice in almost all these scenarios. The best case, the absolute best case, is if the enemy had a starting saving throw of 1. And that means you're getting the maximum bang for your buck on the Malison. In that instance, you would still have to cast 5 more Skull Traps after that in order for the Malison to be worthwhile. By the way, by the time that occurs, like most of these enemies, even greater mummies and maybe Sarevok, are going to be dead anyway. If you have to have cast 5 Skull Traps against them and have them all hit to even have the Malison be worthwhile. It's even worse for other save levels. So like even versus a dragon, you have to cast like Furkrag or Adelon. You have to cast 7 Skull Traps after casting your Malison for the Malison to have been worthwhile. Otherwise you would have been better off just casting 8 Skull Traps. I mean, this is not to mention that doing damage to an enemy, always increases your odds of offing the enemy quicker. It interrupts spell casting. There's other bad things that happen when damage is done. Nothing bad happens when you cast your Malison. So I think this is a lot of numbers and talking just to make the point pretty conclusively that casting Malison is not really worthwhile if you have to give up a round of casting damage spells and your strategy is to kill your enemies through killing them with damage spells, right? Like it's a different analysis if you're using debuffs or save versus spells that do something very nasty to your enemies, and that's your strategy. But if you're trying to kill them through damage spells, then Malison's just not worthwhile, because you'd rather just not care if they make their save and pummel them with an extra iteration of the damage spell. And these numbers illustrate that. I guess the exception is if you're playing with like a super magic heavy party where you have like 3 or 4 arcane casters, and so you really are gonna be casting like 8 different damage spells in a single fight routinely, then maybe this starts to look worthwhile. But basically extreme circumstances. Otherwise, why give up a round of casting the damage spell, instead of just going ahead and hitting him with the skull trap. So, all right, that's the answer on damage spells. It's basically never worthwhile to give up a round to cast Malison if you're just going to follow it up with damage, if that's your strategy. All right, now let's look at the other type of offensive spell casting scenario where you're casting a crowd control spell or some other debuff or a save versus your save or otherwise spell that might kill your enemies, like Finger of Death. How does Malison fare in those scenarios? You'd expect it to be a little bit more useful, because instead of with a damage spell where you're still going to do 50% even if the save is made, it's an all or nothing proposition, right? So Malison should be more useful. And sure enough, it is. So let's go through this analysis. Again, on the left-hand side here, we have the pre-Malison state of the world. And I'm sort of doing the same counterfactual as I did above, where I'm looking at, okay, what if you just cast the spell twice, right? Like, is it better to cast 2 Finger of Deaths at an enemy, or to first cast a Malison and then a Finger of Death? And to answer that, we have to look at the pre-Malison world and post-Malison world. So this column E here is showing your odds of hitting the enemy with the negative effect if you cast the spell twice without casting any Malison, right? No Malison. So in this instance, you're going to have much higher odds than if you only cast it once, obviously, because you have 2 bites at the apple now. And these are what the odds sort of look like. Even against Adelon and Furkrag, you have a 44% chance of hitting with the negative effect based on their saving throw of 6 if you just cast the spell twice. So 2 Finger of Deaths, whatever. A lot of these enemies are immune to such effects, but setting that aside, you're going to have a 44% chance. If you do it 3 times, you're going to have a 58% chance, or 57.8% chance. So this is like the no Malison world. Okay, now let's look at what are the odds if you cast Malison, post Malison. So what this is looking at is the counterfactual world where you cast Malison first and then you cast the spell again. So this is like a 2-round like factual scenario. So assume that there's only 2 rounds in the entire fight. If you cast Malison first and then you're going to cast your Finger of Death, how do your odds compare versus just casting Finger of Death twice? And what emerges here is that, and I'm doing this the same way as I did the first chart, looking at a multiple of your prior odds. What emerges is that for enemies with very low saves, you do much better casting the Malison first. That's just enemies with saves of a -2 through a 6 initial save versus spells, so like very powerful enemies. You do a little bit better casting the Malison first. But for enemies that have a 7 starting save versus spell or higher, you actually do worse if you cast Malison and then the Finger of Death than if you just cast 2 Finger of Deaths. Your odds are worse. So, you have to be looking at fights longer than 2 rounds, or like, multiple attempts to cast these debuffs or instant kill spells on enemies before a Malison starts to be worthwhile if your enemy has a save versus spell of 7 or higher to start. And of course, at these lower initial save versus spell levels where Malison is doing a better job for you, and it is better to cast Malison first, like, you're still not left with great odds of success, right? Post Malison here, your odds are 2.56 times higher than without it, but without it, they're only 9.8%. So, you're improving from like 10% to 25%, but you still only have a 25% chance. Even though the Malison is helping you a lot, because the enemy has such low saves, you still have a pretty low shot. So if you expand the universe a little bit and start looking at 3 rounds, well, now having cast the Malison, is clearly going to pay off. In all scenarios, you're better off casting Malison and then 2 Finger of Deaths than just casting 3 Finger of Deaths. However, the difference is not massive, right? For like an enemy like Realtar, who has a 10 starting save versus spell, you're going to be 1.26 times more likely to hit them with the negative effect if you cast Malison and then the spell twice versus casting the spell 3 times. Not a massive difference. But I think what this goes to show is that, again, you have to really have a strategy of using a lot of negative effect spells from potentially many different arcane casters for Malison to really pay off. If you're only going to have a couple rounds to cast offensive spells because you only have 1 mage, or you need to debuff enemies, or you need to reapply your buffs, then Malison is not going to pay off. You would have been better off just casting Finger of Death twice instead of Malison and then Finger of Death in a lot of scenarios. Okay, that was a lot of numbers. I think the upshot is basically that Malison is really questionably worthwhile if your strategy is to kill enemies through damage dealing spells. If your strategy is to kill or crowd control enemies through save versus negates type spells, then you probably need to be casting 2 or more of those spells for Malison to really be worthwhile. If you only have 3 offensive spellcasting rounds, then in many scenarios, you're about as well off casting 3 iterations of the spell versus Malison in 2 iterations. So I think what this is highlighting is that Malison does give a benefit, but in many scenarios, the benefit is incremental. Certainly, if your strategy is to deal damage through spells instead of doing things like Finger of Death or crowd control, then the benefit is highly questionable whether it's ever going to be worthwhile. And generally speaking, if you're not running multiple mages in your party, like 2 to 3 mages, then in a lot of scenarios, you're going to be better off just using your spellcasting rounds to debuff enemies and fire damage spells at them versus trying to take up a round to cast Malison. Okay, so where does that sort of leave us on the quality of this spell? For me, I find on my runs, the most effective way to kill enemies with magic is to debuff them through secret words and ruby rays and pierce shields or pierce magics and remove magic, and then hit them with AoE damage spells, which are the best damage spells in the game, like Skull Trap, Abidal Zeems, etc. I do not like playing where I'm relying on spells where a saving throw completely negates the effect, because there's just a lot of RNG involved in that. It creates a lot of unpredictability and chances that I waste a super valuable spellcasting round on something that has 0 effect. So, stylistically, there is a stylistic element here. I find that Malison is not very useful, and I generally do not take it until I have access to improved alacrity, and this calculus of whether it's worth it to give up a spellcasting round sort of goes away because you can instantaneously cast Malison. There's no question that in very late game, like in TOB, Malison is a nice spell to stock at least one of, and just throw it out in every high level fight, and it's going to help you a little bit. It's going to make the fight that much easier. So that's definitely a quality spell. But, all through BG1, all through BG2, before you have access to improved alacrity and you can just spam this out instantaneously with Vecna on, I think it's very hard to justify taking Malison over another Stoneskin or improved invisibility or spells that are going to be more valuable at this level. In a lot of fights, you might cast Malison and it is worse for you than casting 2 damage spells. It's worse for you than trying to debuff the enemies so you can actually hit them. It's just not the right choice strategically. So there is a lot of complexity here, but what it boils down to, I think, is that this spell, although it looks very powerful on paper, provides only an incremental benefit. And in a lot of lower level fights or fights where you have to give up a super valuable round of spell casting, it's not worth stocking this or casting it. All that said, there's not another spell that does this better in the game. And this type of debuff is marginally helpful to you no matter what your strategy is. It's not game breaking. It's not something that makes sense to cast in the vast majority of encounters, but it can be helpful to you in some of the toughest fights, especially in TOB. And so, it's not a bad spell. It's still a good spell. I just think this is a very overrated spell where people don't really think about the odds and about the opportunity cost of giving up a spell casting round, especially when considering that, saves aren't that disastrous for you if you're using damage spells that still hit for 50%, even when the save is made. So I think this is a highly overrated spell, but it's a spell that's still good. And I'll rate Greater Malison a 6 out of 10. Okay, that was probably the most complicated or in-depth analysis in this spell level, but I wanted to get super specific with it and not just talk some general bullshit. So went through the numbers. Let's keep going. A lot of these are going to be much shorter. Next spell in level 4 is Ice Storm. Ice Storm is an evocation, a duration of 4 rounds. You can cast it anywhere in the visual range of the caster. It has a 15-foot radius, a cast time of 4, and there is no saving throw. When this spell is cast, great hailstones pound down for 4 rounds in a 30-foot diameter area and inflict 2d8 points of cold damage to any creatures within the area of effect. Also, anyone that remains within the area of effect takes 2d8 cold damage each round for 4 rounds. So this spell, it's the only damage spell in level 4, I believe. Let me just double check that. Yeah, that's correct. It's amazing, but it's true. That's the only damage spell in level 4. I don't think this existed in the base game, even in BG2. I only recall it coming in on the enhanced editions. But it sort of feels like somebody thought, hey, there's no damage spell in Arcane level 4. We better put something in. Unfortunately, this damage spell is very crappy. It is the first spell after Chill Touch in level 1 that does cold damage. But cold damage is not super useful. It's less commonly resisted than fire damage, so it's a better damage type than that. But it's still pretty commonly resisted, especially considering that all undead are completely immune to cold damage. Another thing to highlight about this spell is that it's not party friendly, so you will freeze your own party members. And if we look at the numbers on the damage output here, which is the most important thing for a damage spell, we see that the damage output is horrible. This is supposed to be a level 4 spell, and it does a total of 8d8 damage, and over 4 rounds. So that's 8 to 64 damage in total, or an average of 36 damage spread over 4 rounds. That is very bad. That is very weak, especially because you compare it to a level 3 Skull Trap is doing way more damage than this. So very tough to justify at level 4. I think even if you look at the comparison to Skull Trap, even right when you get this, you're going to get your first level 4 spell slot when you're a level 7 Mage. If you put it on Ice Storm, you're doing something wrong. But just to do the comparison, Skull Trap is doing 76 damage, but all at once. And there's a save versus half in the Skull Trap scenario, but 76 is not horribly different than 8d8. And of course, you're doing it all at once in one round, which is much better than the 8d8 here being split over 4 rounds. By the time you get to level 15, Skull Trap does 15 to 90 damage. And if the save is made, 8 to 45 damage. So this is pretty comparable to Ice Storm all in one round at level 15. By the time, I think that the upshot is Skull Trap is better right when you get this spell. And certainly once you get to higher levels, Skull Trap is just insanely better. At level 20, Skull Trap is doing 20 to 120 damage. Or if the save is made, 10 to 60 damage, all in one round. So vastly more than this spell. 4 rounds is just a very long time inside a fight. Yeah, I guess you could make a case for it trying to interrupt enemy spellcasters through this, and there's no save versus spell to reduce the damage. But you may as well just try to cast a Skull Trap every round. Use Melf's Acid Arrow if you want to get damage every round. Not give up a valuable level 4 spell slot to do so little damage. This is a pretty crappy spell overall. I'll rate this spell a 3 out of 10. I can't bring myself to give it a 2 only because it is the only damage spell in level 4. So theoretically, if you're very late TOB, you're using Wish a lot to refresh your spells in the middle of battle. And so you can afford to give up some level 4 spell slots because you're always going to have your Stoneskin and improved invisibility up. Theoretically, you could take 1 or 2 Ice Storms and throw them out for some small incremental damage in a fight. Given that it's the only damage spell at this level, still a bad spell. Really not any good reason to take it, and I'll rate it a 3 out of 10. Here we go. Next level 4 spell, Improved Invisibility. It's a good one. Improved Invisibility has a duration of 3 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 4, AoE of 1 creature, so it can be the caster or somebody else, whoever the caster selects. No saving throw given it's a buff. This spell is similar to Invisibility, but the recipient is able to attack by missile discharge, melee combat, or spellcasting while remaining unseen. However, Telltale Traces, a shimmering, allow an observant opponent to attack the invisible spell recipient. These traces are only noticeable when specifically looked for, after the invisible creature has made your presence known. Attacks against the invisible character suffer a -4 penalty to attack rolls, and the invisible character's saving throws are made with a +4 bonus. Note, after making an attack, the wizard is no longer completely invisible. Opponents can target the wizard. So, that description, it probably has been improved since the original description in the base game, but it still is not quite accurate as to what this spell, Improved Invisibility, does. So I'll get into that in a second. Let's start off with the duration of the spell, which is always important for a buff spell. So this spell, it's 3 rounds plus 1 per level. So that's a minimum of 7 rounds, given you're going to get it at level 7. That's when you first get access to level 4 spells. At maximum duration, you're talking about 3 rounds plus 20 rounds, so 23 rounds. That means this thing is lasting for 2.3 in real life minutes, which is enough for a couple of fights or most of a dungeon level. So it's a decent duration on a spell. The way this works is that when you initially cast it, you become completely invisible, just like the level 2 spell Invisibility. However, there's an important distinction. When you do an act that would normally break your invisibility when you're under the effect of improved invisibility, instead of just coming completely out of invis, you enter this sort of half invisible state where there's a sort of special rule set as to how opponents can target you when you're in that half visible state. First of all, the things that'll trigger coming out of complete invisibility into that state are things like opening a door or chest, casting a spell on anybody except for the caster who's invisible, attacking, or talking to people. All of that sort of interacting with the outside world, aside from casting buffs on the caster himself, all of that will break the total invis. And if you do that, you step into this half invis state for the remaining duration of the spell. What happens in that half invis state? Well, so opponents can see you, and enemies can also target you with physical attacks, but you still cannot be targeted with spells that are non-AoE spells that are single target spells. So that's a major important distinction. The spell description says that opponents can target the wizard, but that's not really true. As long as the invis spell is still up, you get the -4 penalty to attack rolls, which is the same as a 4 AC bonus, and you get the +4 saves bonus. And in addition, you cannot be targeted with single target spells until the invisibility is dispelled. So at the end of the day, versus regular invis, and what this spell is really about is it's a buff that you're going to use. You could use it just to be invisible, but the duration is much shorter. It'll still help you get the first attack off in a fight, unless the enemy has Detect Invis or True Sight or something, which in the base game, many enemies do not. But really what this is about is the benefits that you still get in that sort of half invis state. By the way, which I'll get into in a second in further detail. By the way, once the initial invis is broken, if you recast improved invisibility or you cast level 2 invis on yourself, you're going to return to full invisibility. So you can, come out of full invis to partial invis, for example, by doing a backstab. Then you can recast full invis on yourself if you're a fighter thief, or as the mage, you could cast it on a fighter in your party. You could recast either level 2 or level 4 improved invis, and the half invis character will go back to full invis. That's just a note on the sort of dynamics of this. So while you're in this half invis state, there are 3 key bonuses that you get. So first, you get this +4 bonus to saves. This is huge. This is the highest plus saves buff in the entire game. And so it's +4 to everything, right? Breath, death, polymorph, spell, and for some reason I'm forgetting the other one. But all 5 saves you get +4 bonus to. So that's like a 20% increased chance of saving if you ignore being at very low saves, given that it's a D20 concept and you're moving 4 pips. When you think about the fact that saves, as we were discussing earlier when we were talking about Malison, it's a D20 concept, but unlike critical misses, if you have 1 or 0 or negative as your saving throw, you can never fail your save. So when you consider that and the fact that this +4 bonus stacks with other buffs, this spell is the easiest way to get yourself into a position where your save versus spell or your save versus death, which are the 2 most important, are 1 or below. And if you're in that state, you can never fail your save. That's a huge protection. That's really important to have up when as sort of another layer of protection in case your spell protections go down when you get to higher levels. It means that you can never be killed by a Finger of Death. You can never be crowd controlled by a spell that is save versus spell with no debuffs or no bonuses along with that. So that's very important to reach that point where your save versus spell is 1 or lower, especially save versus spell because that's the most common save. But save versus death as well. And the fastest way to get there is improved invis, because this spell +4 to all saves is the biggest saves buff in the entire game. So, enough said. If that was all that this spell did, it would already be a pretty good spell, considering it's level 4 and it's the best saves buff in the game. Going on to the other benefits, a +4 bonus to AC. AC is much less valuable later in the game, but that's still a nice buff to have, especially at such a large amount, and in a spell that you're going to take anyway. It's obviously more powerful in BG1, but +4 is a pretty big bonus to AC. Twice as much as Blur at level 2, twice as much as something like Protection from Evil, and of course that's an AC bonus, so it will stack with other AC effects. So that's also nice to have, although the utility scales down over time. And then there's the last factor, which I mentioned earlier. When you're in this half invis state, you can be targeted by enemy physical attacks, whether ranged or melee, but you cannot be targeted by enemy spells that are single target spells. That's a huge deal. If you're playing with SCS, it's much less powerful, because enemies, even in BG1, will cast Detect Invis. In BG2, or even by late BG1, enemies will start casting True Sight against you if you're playing with SCS. So this is going to get debuffed quite quickly, and enemy mages will first rip it down and then find a way to cast spells against you. But in the base game, certainly through all of BG1 and through a lot of BG2, before enemy mages start using True Sight against you, not being able to be targeted by enemy spells will sort of break the mage AI in the game. Certainly in BG1, in the base game, improved invis, I'm not even sure if it existed before Tales of the Sword Coast. I don't think it did. And I'm not sure if improved invis was even accessible to anybody other than sorcerers in BG1 prior to the enhanced editions. I'm not really sure, but certainly a lot of BG1 and the BG1 Mage AI was written before this spell was something that was accessible in BG1. Of course, now you can buy this spell in Olgoth's Beard from level 1 with Tales of the Sword Coast, and you can start casting it as soon as you hit level 7. And the way that in the base game Mage AI works in Baldur's Gate 1 is that the mages first try to crowd control you, which is usually through something like chaos or confusion. That type of spell, that's AoE. The improved invis is going to help you through the +4 bonus to saves, but it's not going to completely protect you. However, after doing that initial crowd control spell, enemy mages will just try to hit you with different single target damage spells, like Melf's Acid Arrow or Magic Missile. That's most of the mages that you face in BG1 have that sort of AI pattern. Now, obviously, if you avoid the CC in part through the +4 bonus to saves from having improved invis up, and then you still are in this half invis state, then a mage that the AI is telling to cast Acid Arrow or Magic Missile or some other single target spell at you will have absolutely nothing to do, because you can't be targeted by that spell. This just completely breaks a lot of enemy mages in BG1, this one spell. The mages will not have Detect Invis or some other means of dispelling it, and will just try to attack you with their staff, with their horrible Thaco, attacking into your buffed up AC. So this, in BG1, before enemies start using True Sight, this is a very powerful effect that will make many fights against enemy mages a piece of cake, just through the fact that you can't be targeted with single target spells. Even later on, if you happen to be playing, if you're in the base game and you're playing against high level mages that have not cast True Sight, or a party of enemies where you already killed the cleric or the mage that was the True Sight caster, then this becomes very powerful again, to protect yourself against being hit by single target mage spells. Overall, this spell, the utility does decrease in very late game, but even in very late game, when it's important to have guaranteed saves, you're still getting a huge bonus to saves through this spell. Overall, improved invisibility is a great buff. It's not as good as one of the other buffs in this level, which we'll get to later. So I'm generally not taking this much in BG1, except when I'm going to go up against some mages who won't know how to handle it. But for the toughest fights, or once I have 3 to 4 level 4 spell slots, then I'm always taking some improved invis, just given how powerful these buffs are. I'll rate this spell a 9 out of 10. A very strong spell. It has uses throughout the saga. You always want to have this up if you're going into a tough fight, and the AC bonus, the saves bonus, and the being immune to enemy single target spells are all quite powerful. Utility of some of them diminishes over time in the saga, but the saves bonus is always amazing and is useful throughout the entire saga. So I'll rate this a 9 out of 10 spell. Next spell is Minor Globe of Invulnerability. So another buff spell. And that's sort of a theme with level 4. I was likening it to level 2 magic in just that the spells that are good in this level, just like level 2 has Blur and Mirror Image, level 4 has good buff spells that are going to dominate your spell book in level 4. So Minor Globe of Invulnerability. This has a duration of 1 round per level, a cast time of 4, an area of effect of a 5-foot radius sphere. I'm not really sure if that's really not accurate. The area of effect is the mage that casts this spell. You can't put another character near the mage that casts this spell and get the benefit of the globe. It's just the caster. So it should really not say 5-foot radius AoE. There's no saving throw given it's a buff. What does it do? This spell creates a faintly shimmering magical sphere around the caster that prevents any first, second, or third level spell effects from penetrating, i.e., the area of effect of any such spells does not include the area of the Minor Globe of Invulnerability. This includes innate abilities and effects from devices. However, any type of spell can be cast out of the magical sphere, and these pass from the caster of the globe to their subject without affecting the globe. Spells of 4th level or higher are not affected by the globe. Okay, what does this do? So it's obviously a protection against level 1 through 3 spells only. That does include both arcane and divine spells. It only affects the caster. And overall, for reasons I'll get into here, I think this is a very underrated spell that is really a quite strong anti-magic protection. Obviously, it's going to lose utility as you get much later in the game, but this is, through all of BG1 and the first half, at least the first half of BG2, this is a quite strong anti-magic protection, and I think an underrated spell. And I'll get into why in a minute. The key reason why this spell protection, I think, stands out from others and is quality is that this spell protection, Minor Globe, and its counterpart, Major Globe, which we'll get to later, and I think is the worst of the two spells for reasons I can get into when we get to level 6 and Major Globe. But this spell, Minor Globe and Major Globe, in addition to spell immunity, the level 5 spell, these are the only spell protections that will protect you against AoE spells. And spell immunity does not protect you against friendly cast spells. So that means that Major and Minor Globe of Invulnerability are literally the only protections in the game, the only spell protections in the game, like as opposed to resistances, that protect you against both your own and your enemy's AoE, crowd control, and damage spells. So just to break that down for a second, you can cast spell deflection, minor spell deflection, spell turning, minor spell turning, spell shield, spell trap, all that crap on yourself, all those spell protections. And those things will not protect you at all against AoE damage spells, which obviously are the strongest and scariest damage spells in the game. So like that's sort of a little bit of a paradox about spell protections. They only protect you against single target spells. I talked about this when I was going over level 3, the level 3 resistance spells. That reason is one reason why having resistances to damage types is really important to protect yourself against AoE damage. If you don't have access to resistances, if you don't have 100% resistance to elemental and magic damage, then you're gonna need minor or major globe as the only way to protect you against AoE damage spells. And obviously there's level limitations, but that means that this spell just does have some, does sort of occupy a special place, given that it's one of the best ways to protect yourself against AoE damage spells. Resistances are the best way, but you don't have any spell, for example, until level 6 that gets you resistance to magic damage. So minor globe of invulnerability is literally the only way to protect yourself against skull trap until you get level 6 spells. Minor globe is the only way to protect yourself against skull trap all through BG1. That's just an example of why this spell does have some special utility and I think is underrated and worth considering. Also, one other minor note is, as we discussed when we were talking about level 2, mirror image also does not give protection against AoE damage spells. So truly, the only way to get protection against AoE damage spells, first you get protection from cold and protection from fire in level 3, and then in level 4 you get minor globe. Those are your ways to protect yourself against AoE damage spells until later levels. So that's sort of why I think there's a good niche for this spell. And beyond the AoE factor, when you're fighting enemy magic users in BG1, by and large, even if they're higher level enemy magic users, the things that they're going to use to kill you are going to be level 1 to 3 spells. Sure, there are nasty crowd control spells at level 4 and 5, like Chaos and Confusion, and very high level spellcasters will cast. I think there's 1 or 2 mages that'll cast Cloud Kill against you, but by and large, when you're facing enemy mages all through BG1, the things that they're going to use against you that are scary and that are really going to do damage are level 1 through 3 spells. Web, Magic Missile, Hold Person, which clerics always seem to try, and I always seem to fail my save to. Acid Arrow, Fireball, Lightning Bolt, Skull Trap. These are the things that are actually going to kill you, that are in the arsenal of BG1 spellcasters. All of these things are things that Minor Globe makes you completely immune to. And on top of that, if you're playing a caster heavy party, or you're playing solo, or you just want to move your fighters out of the way, or give them a free action potion or the ring of free action and use a bunch of webs, you can use Minor Globe to make your own arcane magic users completely immune to these nasty effects and then blast them off against your enemies. So, you can spam skull traps all around you, fireballs if you want, webs, whatever nasty non-party friendly AoE spells exist, and those are the strongest ones in level 1 through 3. You can spam those things around, and as long as you have your Minor Globe up, you're going to be completely immune. That's pretty cool. I think this spell is also especially useful in the final fight in BG1, given that the mage that's accompanying Saravok in that fight, I think it might be, I'm not going to remember. It's not Tazog and it's not Angelo, so Senaj, Senaj, but that mage uses web, fireball, and lightning bolt against you, and then there's also a skull trap in the middle of the room. So there's lots of possibilities of getting hit with nasty 1 through 3 level spells in the final fight, and Minor Globe is super helpful for avoiding that damage. In fact, there's even a very cheesy way to kill Saravak, which I think is actually used, or a form of it, in like the speed runs of BG1, where you just cast Minor Globe on yourself, and then you lure Saravak to the middle of the room where the skull traps are, and then just trip them repeatedly. You're completely immune, and the skull traps will kill Saravak. We don't have to be that cheesy, but that's just an illustration of how powerful this spell, Minor Globe, can be, at least all the way through BG1. It's also worth noting that because this is a spell protection, unlike your resistances, it's not going to be dispelled by remove or dispel magic. And in the base game, enemies don't have spell thrust or secret word to use to debuff you. In SCS, enemies will use those spells against you to remove your Minor Globe, but in the base game, enemies don't use those spells. So you know going into a fight that if you cast this on yourself, you're going to be protected for the duration of the fight. There's nothing that enemy mages will do to take this buff off of you. Obviously, the utility of Minor Globe drops off into very late game, when enemies start to use entirely spells above level 3 as their main damage spells against you. But even through mid BG2, you see enemies still using Skull Trap, Lightning Bolt, and Fireball. You see traps that do those effects. And if you have this spell up on yourself, no matter what your resistances are, or whether your resistances have been debuffed through a remove magic or whatever, you know that you can still spam a Skull Trap all around yourself as a level 20 mage, which is very powerful, and not get hit. So overall, I end up relying much more on resistances once TOB rolls around, certainly, but there is a place for this spell, and it's extremely powerful against mages in the base game. It's also one of the best buffs that you can possibly have in the final fight of BG1. So I think this is overall an underrated spell and a quality buff that has a unique place in protecting you against AoE damage spells. And I'll rate this spell a 7 out of 10. Here we go. Next spell in level 4, Minor Sequencer. This spell is a cast time of 9, the longest possible, and a permanent duration. The area of effect is special because it adds a special ability to the caster, and no saving throw, given it's a buff. This spell allows a wizard to store 2 spells and activate them both at the same time from her special ability button. Both spells must be of 2nd level or lower. To create a sequencer, a mage must memorize not only Minor Sequencer, but also the spells she intends to store in it. A sorcerer can store spells of any level for which she still has spell slots. After casting Minor Sequencer, the player will be prompted to choose the sequenced spells from those she has memorized. A sequencer lasts until activated, and once used, releases its spells immediately, no casting time. The special ability icon also disappears until the next time a sequencer is formed. A wizard can possess only 1 Minor Sequencer at a time, and it may not be given to other characters. So I just noticed this description. It says a sorcerer can store spells of any level for which she still has spell slots. I don't think that's true. This only allows you to store up to level 2 spells. So just to talk about what this is, we're getting to yet another game dynamic by the time we get to level 4. We already talked about spell protections, resistances, remove and dispel magic, things like invisibility, non-detection, etc. And now, for the first time, we have a sequencer spell. There's 2 of these, I believe. There's Minor Sequencer, and then there's Spell Trigger, which you get later on. And what they allow you to do is basically store some spells in a special ability that's activated instantly, as the spell description says, and that special ability, like many special abilities in the game, has a cast time of 0. So the second, regardless the cast time of the spells that you stored, the second that you activate the ability, the spells will go off, and that's quite handy. For a lower level mage, one of the key things that you have to worry about is getting hit by things and having your casting interrupted. So anything that can get spells out instantly is very powerful. This sequencer, the minor sequencer, will allow you to cast, to store both divine and arcane spells in it. So sequencers and contingency spells are yet another reason why there's a lot of synergies for cleric mages in this game. And in fact, I think a lot of the best potential candidates for a sequencer involve priest spells of level 1 or 2. For example, Silence is a really powerful divine spell in level 2. You can double a silence spell in a sequencer to almost guarantee that you're going to silence low to mid-level enemy casters. You can also pop a Sanctuary into a sequencer, and Sanctuary is even better than Invisibility because it can't be dispelled by things like True Sight or Detect Invisibility for protecting yourself if you're in a tight spot in battle. So there are synergies with the priest lineup of spells, and in particular, I like putting sanctuaries inside sequencers as an oh shit button. Even without comboing with divine magic, though, there's still some decent choices in the arcane spellbook to put in here. Obviously, this is quite limited as you can only do level 1 or 2 spells. I think overall, there's probably 2 use cases for the minor sequencer. You can either use it, as I was just saying, as an oh shit button to protect yourself, is an instant cast if you're in trouble in battle. It's sort of like a potion, but more powerful because you can have 2 effects. So Invisibility and Mirror Image is usually what I have in my minor sequencer as a oh crap button to immediately give myself some protections against physical attacks and also turn invisible for long enough to run away. You could do Invisibility and Slow Poison if you have divine spells. You could do Sanctuary and Mirror Image if you have divine spells. So it sort of can be used this way as an oh crap, I'm in trouble, I need to get away button. And it's useful for that. It can also be used to add 2 spells to your spellbook, basically, as you go into harder battles as a mid to low level mage. So, as a level 7 mage, you might only have, I don't know, by that point, you're getting your first level 4 spell. You probably have 3 or 4 level 1 and 2. You have 2 or 3 level 3 spells, and you have 1 level 4 spell. You might have 10 spell slots in total. Now you can, because the duration of the sequencer is permanent, you can put 2 spells into it, then rest, and then restock. And at that point, you'll have given yourself like a nice about 20% boost to your total spell inventory because you've got 2 in the sequencer on top of your entire fully memorized spell book. So you can use that for offensive spells to get off quickly during battles. A good one is 2 times web to spam out 2 webs. You're probably gonna stun in the first try entire mobs of enemies with 2 times web spells. You can do 2 times magic missile, 2 times Melf's acid arrow. You could try 2 times Agonizer's Scorcher, although the wand would still be about as good as that, given that Agonizer's is much less damage than the fire wand. So that one's probably more questionable. But the point is, by doubling up, you can make pretty decent single target magic spells. I like 2 times web the best because web is the type of spell that you want to get out at the beginning of battle. And sometimes if you can get it off before the battle even begins, while enemies are off screen, or as they're coming towards you, it'll completely end the fight before the fight really begins, because you'll stun most or all of your enemies if you're doubling up on a -2 to save spell like Web. So 2 times Web is a pretty good choice. I think overall, this spell, obviously it's losing almost all utility once you get to mid BG2, when having an extra level 1 to 2 spell is really not significant. So this is really an early and mid game type spell. But the thing that's nice about this is that since the duration is permanent, you can sort of put it in your back pocket, cast it once, and you never know when in the saga you might need it. Generally speaking, I tend to put either 2 times webs in here for tough battles, or an invis and mirror image, or sanctuary and mirror image. And there are definitely times when that's coming useful. If you're out of potions, if you know that just being invisible is not going to be enough because there's an enemy that has true sight, but you want to have a round of protection and you need a mirror image, this can be what you use. So it's like, why not, right? It's permanent, so if you never use it, it'll just give you a little bit of optionality, and it never goes away. So it's a tiny buff, but it's almost nothing to prepare it. It's useful in some tougher battles early in the saga, and you really give up nothing to add a couple of spell slots to your mage effectively, and have them be there for all time until you use them. So it's a decent spell. I'm going to rate it a 4 out of 10. Just because the utility disappears sort of mid BG2, or at least goes to being de minimis value. But 4 out of 10 spell, decent spell for minor sequencer. Next up, all right. So we just went through a series of pretty great spells, right? We had Greater Malison, Ice Storm, not so good, but improved Invis, Minor Globe, and Minor Sequencer, all quality spells. Now we get back to some absolute trash. Monster Summoning 2. The duration here is 3 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 4. And the description says, this spell is much like the 3rd level Monster Summoning 1 spell. All right, I already know it's going to stink. Except that this spell summons 4 HD monsters. There's a 60% chance of receiving 1 monster and a 40% chance of receiving 2 monsters. So this spell is just marginally better than the level 3 spell, which was one of the worst spells at spell level 3 and one of the most disappointing spells in the game. And this one is almost that bad. The difference is you get slightly powerful summons. That's really it. With this spell, you can summon either an ogre that has 30 hit points, 1 attack per round, and is level 4. A Gnoll elite that has a 17 Thaco, just to highlight how bad that is. 1 APR, is level 2 and has 18 hit points. A Direwolf, which has 33 hit points, 1 APR, 14 Thaco, and is level 4. Or a Hobgoblin elite, which is 30 hit points, 2 APR, 13 Thaco, and is level 4. The Hobgoblin elite is probably the best of these crappy monsters. It has one of the higher hit points. It has 2 APR, and it fires ranged weapons. Anything that has 30 to 17 to 18 that's the Gnoll elite to 33 hit points is going to get shredded fast in this game. So it's better to have something ranged at least. But all these enemies suck, right? By the time you have access to level 4 mage spells, you have fighters in your party that would shred any of these enemies. You can shred them yourself with wands or damage spells. These are very weak enemies with no resistances. And I need to highlight again, this is another problem. This is the same problem with level 3 Monster Summoning 1. For Monster Summoning 2, there's still literally no way that this spell is better than the Wand of Monster Summoning. The Wand of Monster Summoning summons 12 HD of monsters, so 3 monsters. It's instant cast, and it has longer duration at the levels where you'd really consider casting this. And it summons the exact same monsters. So the Wand of Monster Summoning is better. It's better in every way, or equal or better in every way than this spell. And when you have a wand that's better than a level 4 spell slot that you could be taking a Stoneskin or an improved Invis in, that you're going to take the wand every time. This is a horrible spell. Never take it. Instead, use the wand if you want to summon monsters this week. And I'm going to rate this a 1 out of 10. One of the worst spells in the level. Really bad. Next spell is Otiluke's Resilient Sphere. This spell has a duration of 1 turn, a cast time of 4, an area of effect of 1 creature, and a saving throw negates. When this spell is cast, the result is a globe of shimmering force that encloses the subject creature if it fails to save for a spell. The Resilient Sphere will contain its subject for the duration of the spell. The sphere is completely immune to all damage. In fact, the only method of removing the sphere is a successful dispel magic. Hence, the creature caught inside the globe is completely safe from all attacks, but at the same time completely unable to affect the outside world. Okay, so this is, I don't know who Otiluke is. Otiluke. Never see the name, I don't think, anywhere else in the lore except for on the name of this spell. And this is an oddball spell. I think this is a tough scroll to come by in BG1. You only get it towards the end of BG1, I believe. And I think this spell might have been introduced with, this is definitely not in the base game. This is like an expansion spell, like Wraith Form at level 3, I'm pretty sure. And it's an unusual spell with unusual spell dynamics, so I'll get into those dynamics. The punchline is, this is a pretty forgettable one because it's not a great spell, but let's get into how this actually works. First of all, the duration is 1 turn, equals 10 rounds, equals 1 minute of in real life time. That's the length of a medium length to long length battle. It's not a super long time. It's enough time to take one character out of the fight until the fight is probably going to be resolved. So let's go through what this actually does. I think the first point to note is that this really is not clear from the description, but this spell will actually stun the target. So unlike Sanctuary or Invis, etc., the affected creature can't do anything to help itself out, like cast a spell or move around. So not only can the affected creature not affect the outside world, but it isn't even selectable. You can't even select your party member if it's inside the sphere. So this really is sort of like a baby imprisonment, I guess, or a baby maze. It just completely, takes the target out of the fight, and the target can't do anything. They're stunned while they're under the effect of the sphere. I will note, regeneration will continue to work when the stunned character is inside the sphere, but the no actions can be taken by that character. What is the character that's inside the sphere stunned protected against? So I tested a bunch of things. AoE spells, completely immune to everything. Immune to True Sight and Divination spells, not affected by True Sight or Divination. That makes sense. This is an alteration spell, not an illusion spell, so there's no interaction with True Sight or Divination spells. The affected creature is also made invisible by the spell, so it can't be targeted with things like breach, etc. So that means no single target dispels will work. And the only way to get rid of this is therefore with the dispel magic or remove magic. Only dispel magic or remove magic will get rid of the sphere. Another very important point as to how this works in my testing. In my testing of this, so I was testing whether this saving throw negates is as advertised. And in my testing of that, the spell will always proc when you cast it on your own party member. So even if the game dialogue says save versus spell or magic resistance, the spell still procs. So I think what's going on is that even though the game is giving a save versus spell or checking for magic resistance, there's something hard coded into the way that this spell works that says that tests that if it's a friendly party member that cast it, it's always going to work. It's always going to go off. So if you're casting it on your own party, then the spell will always work to take a party member out of the fight. Enemies, on the other hand, do get a save versus spell, which is very important. This is not going to be guaranteed to take an enemy out of the fight. Enemies do get a save. All right, so let's go through what all these weird dynamics really mean for the use case and quality of this spell. So first of all, if you're thinking about casting this on an enemy, I sort of don't get it. Only because the enemy does get a save versus spell with no penalty, and that means that this is worse than, say, slow or web or even confusion, which have bonuses to save to try to crowd control enemies. Also, obviously, if the enemy does fail their save, all you did was lock that enemy away for 10 rounds, and you're still going to have to deal with the enemy as soon as the sphere wears off. You're not going to be able to do anything to damage the enemy while they're in the sphere. So it's like, if you can't actually kill the enemy during the effect and there's no saves bonus, this again is not better than level 2 web for incapacitating enemies, really. If you want a single target incapacitation, then you could go with blindness, and that's another very debilitating spell for enemies, but one that will still allow you to kill the enemy while they're standing there not able to see you. So it's not really useful as an offensive spell. The other thing to consider, the other question to ask is obviously whether this is helpful to protect your own party members. So for example, you see that a party member is in a circle of enemies and getting beat down, and you want to take that member out of the fight to allow them to survive. Well, first of all, this has a cast time of 4. That's a pretty decent cast time. Like, you're going to have to act really quickly to save a party member that's in that situation. That's going to be a lot slower than that party member just popping invisibility potion or a haste potion to run away or whatever. Also, longer fights do last for longer than 10 rounds, and if the fight's going poorly, especially, those fights tend to drag out. So you're not guaranteed to protect your friend until the end of the fight. And when the sphere wears off, the character is going to emerge just as naked and low HP as they were when they went into the sphere, except for regen. But on the flip side, if your party member is affected by buff spells, those might also run out during the 10-round duration. So a weak ally that goes into the sphere will still come out weak, and unless the fight's over, about just as likely to die. Overall, it's an interesting concept, but I find myself never taking this. I think there's just better spells for doing both things. There's better spells for incapacitating enemies that allow you to kill the enemies while they're incapacitated, and there's better spells like invisibility or using a minor spell sequencer or sanctuary or an invis potion to allow your own party to press the oh shit button and try to protect themselves. If there was a cast time of 0 on this or 1, I think it'd be a lot more interesting for instantly taking out of the fight party members that are about to die. Overall, I'd love to find something to do with this because of the unique mechanic of a guaranteed proc on your own party, but I really can't think of anything. Improved Invis and Stoneskin are both better buffs and better things to cast when you're in trouble in the middle of a fight as other examples. So I'll rate this spell a 2 out of 10. Interesting, but ultimately not a very useful spell. I guess the last note I would make on this, which might affect my rating, is that I thought recently of one situation in the entire saga where this spell might actually be a bit helpful, is that tough fight in the palace with the greater doppelgangers, where you face Saravok for the first time. I wonder whether, even though they would have to save versus the spell, it makes sense to try to put the dukes into resilient spheres so that they can't be killed by the doppelgangers. Because usually that's the reason why I end up losing that fight, especially with SCS. Magic users will just start flinging out AoE damage spells inside the palace, and it's very hard to keep the dukes alive. So this spell would be uniquely suited to that purpose, but I've never tested it. So, maybe I'll test it at some point and come back and put a note or something, or if you have, let me know. But that is the one scenario where I can see this being useful. Maybe that alone, given the difficulty of that fight, would move this to being a 3 out of 10 spell. But I'll leave it at 2 out of 10 for now, given I still haven't found any use for it. Next spell, Polymorph Other. This spell has a permanent duration, a cast time of 4, an area of effect of 1 creature, and a saving throw negates. This is sort of a long description. I'm just gonna break this down to something very simple, which is that this is a single target enemy spell, enemy crowd control spell / debuff, that if the enemy fails a save versus petrification / polymorph, the enemy will turn into a squirrel. Okay, so what does that mean more specifically? The turning into a squirrel is permanent, so only a dispel or remove magic will bring enemies back from being a squirrel. Otherwise, they'll stay a squirrel permanently. And what do they do once they become a squirrel? Well, first of all, squirrels have very low hit points, maybe 1 or 2 physical attacks. They cannot cast any spells. The squirrels will attack you, but once an enemy has been transformed into a squirrel, it seems to only have 2 APR and do 5 to 6 slashing damage per hit. So it's still possible, technically, to die to the squirrel, although the squirrels are pretty slow, they have really low HP, so you should be able to kite and kill them easily. It goes without saying that an enemy that's going to die in 1 or 2 hits is pretty slow and is doing 2 APR with 5 to 6 slashing damage is an enemy that's easily dispatched. So that effect of making enemies into squirrels that have drastically reduced HP, are slow, and lose all their ability to cast magic, that is super powerful. That is very debilitating. It takes the enemy completely out of the fight and makes them much, much easier to kill. So this really is Polymorph Other is the nastiest single target debuff that you get prior to Finger of Death. This is the nastiest one, just because of the massive HP reduction and all the other bad things that this will do to your enemies. Completely debilitating if you get this off. So there is something to be said for this spell. Now let's assess the save here. It's a strange one because it is an unusual save. It's not save versus spell, right? It's save versus petrification / polymorph. So let's look at how that save type compares to a save versus spell. I'll take some example creatures that you might use this against and just give a comparison. So as an example, a Greater Wyvern has a save versus death of 3, a save versus spell of 4, and a save versus petrification and polymorph of 4. Sword Spider, save versus death 11, spell 14, poly 12. Werewolf, death 13, spell 15, poly 13, and Furkrag, Death 3, Spell 6, Poly 4. So you can see it varies creature to creature, but I think the general theme is that saves versus polymorph are usually a bit harder to make than saves versus death, but a bit easier to make those saves than a save versus spell, right? The Sword Spider is a good example. Save versus death 11, so only you need to roll an 11 for the Sword Spider to save. Spell 14, the Spider only needs to roll a 14, so a bit higher, 3 pips higher than death to save or spell. And then Polymorph is 12, so 1 higher than death. So you're 5% more likely to hit with a Polymorph than a death save against a Sword Spider. That's pretty generally representative. So I think, I don't know, this is like a glass half empty, glass half full sort of spell. You could say that we're all the way at level 4 and we still really haven't found a single target disable that's much better than level 1 blindness, because blindness will hit a bit more often than this spell and is also pretty debilitating when it does go off. Maybe not to melee type enemies that you're already meleeing, but blindness is a nasty effect to hit enemies with. The effect of this spell is worse though, and a lot of times the save versus poly is quite close to the save versus spell. For many mid-level enemies, once you get to late BG1 or BG2, this is a pretty good disable, because in addition to disabling the enemy, you're going to take off a ton of HP. And plus, there is a fun factor absolutely at higher levels with this spell. When you combine it with Malison and cast it multiple times inside Alacrity, you can have a decent shot of turning anything in the game that's not magic resistant into a squirrel. And that's pretty cool. There are definitely enemies that are immune to this effect, just like there are enemies that have random immunities to a lot of effects, including many that are immune to blindness once you get to TOB. But there are a lot of enemies that are subject to this. You can definitely turn dragons into squirrels if you cast enough instances of this spell against them. So I sort of struggled with how to rate this. I think it's highly stylistic. Again, I really disfavor spells where if the enemy saves, it completely negates the effect of the spell. Still, I think I'm going to rate this a 4 out of 10. I rated blindness 3 out of 10. And this spell is more fun. It's more debilitating, and oftentimes for similar save odds. And, particularly against enemies with a ton of HP, this is a super powerful spell that could effectively do like 100 or 150 damage per hit. Of course, you need to soften up the enemy with different debuffs and probably a Malison, or cast this multiple times to have a shot. But there's still something to be said for that. Situationally useful and always hilarious when you get it off. So I'll rate this spell a 4 out of 10 for Polymorph Other. Next up, the corollary of Polymorph Other, which is Polymorph Self. Polymorph Self has a duration of 1 turn plus 3 rounds per level, a cast time of 4, an area of effect of the caster, and no saving throw given it's a buff. Now, the description here is pretty long, so I'm not going to read it. It does provide a high-level description of the things that you can turn into, which makes them sound a lot better than they actually are, for the most part. But I'll skip over that and discuss the forms in detail as I go through this spell. So this is the first instance of a polymorph spell. Unfortunately, it's very, very, very weak compared to shapeshift that you get at level 9 or druid transformations or that type of thing. As we'll get to as we go through what the different options are. Mechanically, the way this spell works is that you cast it, and then for the duration of the spell, you get special abilities that allow you to polymorph. And the special abilities can be triggered once per round, or, just like any other special abilities, if theoretically you had Polymorph Self up and improved alacrity, then you could change form as much as you wanted, because the polymorph does have a cast time of 0. So the only thing that limits it is the limitation in the absence of improved alacrity that you can only cast one spell per round. So I guess there's some like theoretical use case where you very rapidly shapeshift between different polymorph forms inside an alacrity. That's not ever really gonna come in handy, given that you, as I'll get into, you maintain your HP as you polymorph. So it's not like you heal yourself by doing this. But that's how it works mechanically. You get special abilities that allow you to change into different forms. These polymorph states, so let's talk about what actually is affected when you polymorph. It's not totally intuitive what changes and what doesn't change about yourself when you change into different forms. The states did not affect your HP or saves, right? I already said that about HP, but if you have 1 HP prior to polymorphing out of 100, post polymorphing, you're going to stay at 1 out of 100. You don't change your HP as you switch between forms. You also don't change your saves. The polymorphing only affects the following things. First of all, in any of the polymorphed forms, and you can always switch back to human, but in any of the polymorphed forms, your spellcasting is completely disabled. Obviously, a problem, right? That's a theme. Whenever there are spells, whether it's touch spells or tensors or whatever that disable your spellcasting as a mage or sorcerer, that's generally never going to be very good. So your spellcasting is disabled. Your attack changes to the attack of the creature, so that means you lose your primary weapon. Your movement speed changes to the creatures. Your AC changes to the creatures and can't be changed by armor anymore. So your base AC changes to the creatures. Your AC still will be reduced by items in your pack. And in general, even if you're polymorphed through this spell, your items will continue to benefit you, right? The sole exception is your armor. Or something that would set your armor class. So if you polymorph and you have an amulet of protection +1 and you're wearing Robe of the Archmagi, the robe setting your armor to 5 will be overridden by whatever the AC of the polymorphed creature is, but the +1 that you get from the amulet will still be present once you even post polymorphing. The other thing that changes when you polymorph is your resistances will change into the resistances of the polymorphed form. Again here though, the items in your pack will continue to benefit you. So if you had a Ring of Fire resistance or an item that gave you some magic resistance, you would maintain that resistance post being polymorphed, and that would be added to any resistances that were generated by the polymorphed form. Okay, that's a summary of what changes and what not. So obviously the strength of this spell is going to be dictated by the strength of the different forms that you can change into. And I'm not going to get into the precise detail of all the forms. The Baldur's Gate 2 wiki has a really nice description of each of the forms. I'll make sure that's linked in the description to this video. Instead, I'll sort of break it down at a high level. So you have 7 forms. You have a wolf, a black bear, a brown bear, which is exactly the same as the black bear except for appearance. So like you have 7 different forms, but one of them is literally changing brown versus black. I guess, if you got to match your shoes or something. A spider, a flind, an ogre, and a mustard jelly. So you've got these 7 forms. So let's keep it simple and sort of categorize these forms. So first of all, everything except for the wolf and the jelly, which I'll get into in a second, which have some resistances, everything else is just going to turn you into a bad 1 to 3 APR fighter. The Flind, I guess, stands out because it has +1 fire damage and attacks with a halberd that strikes as a +3 weapon. So I guess theoretically you could use the Flind to fight enemies that can only be hit by +3 weapons, but that's like very high level enemies or BG2 Belafet, BG2 boss type enemies. If you're transforming into a Flind and disabling your spell casting against those enemies, you're going to get roasted. So, you know, not actually that useful to have the Flind hit with a magical weapon. Other than that, all these other ones, you know, the black bear, the brown bear, the spider, the ogre, you're transforming yourself into a 1 to 3 APR fighter that's weaker than you probably would be if you were a fighter of equal level and had full access to your proficiencies and your magic weapons that you would have by this point of the game. So, you know, big whoop. The spider does have a poison attack. Who cares? You know, all of these things are vastly worse than keeping your spell casting and still being able to attack for 1 to 2 APR as a mage. So, like, I really don't think there's any real use case for transforming into any of the ogre, the Flind, the spider, the brown bear, or the black bear. And that leaves just the wolf and the mustard jelly to consider. The only reason that they stand out is because of these resistances. So to get into those resistances specifically, for the wolf is 100% cold resistant and 50% electricity resistant for some reason. So, you know, theoretically, if you wanted to be 100% protected from cold, you could polymorph yourself into a wolf. Of course, there's a level 3 spell with a very long duration, protection from cold, that makes you immune to cold, and you can still do everything that a mage does. So I can't really see any reason to use the wolf form instead of just stocking protection from cold or some protection from cold scrolls and potions. So the wolf, I guess there's a theoretic use case, but not better than the alternatives that you have available. And that really leaves the mustard jelly as the last form standing. I think in general, it's almost comical how much better than all the other forms this one form is. This is really the only one worth considering, and it's way, way better than any of the other forms here. So the mustard jelly is immune to regular weapons, so that's hugely powerful through BG1 against lower level enemies. Its attack slows and has a poison effect as well. That requires 2 saves by enemies to avoid both of them. A save versus death to avoid the poison, and a save versus breath to avoid the slow. And also, the mustard jelly has resistances to physical damage types in part, and it's also completely magic immune with 125% magic resistance, which makes this form capable of soloing high-level mages in Baldur's Gate all the way through Baldur's Gate 1 until in BG2, mages are going to start to have lower resistance or just have good physical attacks that can beat the physical attacks of a mustard jelly. It's worth noting that Dispel Magic will not get rid of the polymorphed state. So once you're in the form of this mustard jelly, there's no way for enemies to get you out of the form. The only way that enemy mages could hurt you is through using physical attacks like Melfs or energy blades or something, or their weapons, or casting lower resistance on you when you're in your mustard jelly form. So overall, the mustard jelly is clearly the best form to polymorph yourself into. It's really the only one that has any real use case for it. But I think I need to remind everybody of the fact that the level 1 spell, Find Familiar, if you're a lawful evil mage and you have the lawful evil familiar, the Lawful Evil Familiar can cast its special ability is Dispel Polymorph Self, and so it can turn into a mustard jelly from level 1, while you as the mage can continue to cast spells or stay out of the fight or do whatever you want to do. So yes, the mustard jelly is a strong form, but if you're Lawful Evil, which I think any power gaming arcane magic user should be for access to this familiar, then you have access to the mustard jelly from level 1. And so if we believe that the mustard jelly is so strong, then I think you're just going to release your familiar from your pack and have it turn into the mustard jelly instead of needing to take up a level 4 spell slot for that. I guess for fun, you and your familiar could both turn into mustard jellies and go take down mages twice as fast, but the familiar's spell duration lasts for plenty long to solo a fight with a bunch of mages in BG1. So overall here, mustard jelly definitely saves this spell. If it wasn't for that form, then this would be like really insulting spell that just allows you to nerf yourself by turning yourself into a really bad fighter instead of a powerful mage. But you do have access to that through the Lawful Evil familiar. I think in general, if there was one, this spell is sort of like on the list of where I would focus if I was trying to improve the game a little bit and make it more fun. There are so many cool things that could be done with a Polymorph Self if the polymorphed forms just had a bit more variety and 6 out of 7 of them weren't boring old fighters. Like, this could have been much cooler. I mean, why can't you get like a wyvern with a really strong poison attack, or be a phase spider that can teleport around to your enemies, or turn into an ankeg that can burrow under the earth and then pop up anywhere? Like, I don't think those things would be totally busted for a spell that you only get access to at level 7. And those would all be super fun and, make this spell much more powerful and worth considering. Instead, you just get mustard jelly, which the Lawful Evil Familiar can do from level 1. So I'm going to rate this spell a 3 out of 10 for Polymorph Self. Next spell is Remove Curse. Remove Curse has a permanent duration because it permanently removes a curse. Cast time of 4, area of effect of 1 creature, can be any creature, the caster or otherwise, and a saving throw of none, given that this always works to remove a curse when you cast it. This is a pretty straightforward spell. There's not that much to say about it. There are certain enemy abilities and items that will curse your characters, which afflicts them with various negative effects, and curses are permanent until dispelled by Remove Curse. Remove Curse is the only way to get rid of a curse. So if you equip a cursed item, you're going to need to cast this spell, or you go to any temple and you can buy Remove Curse. It's also worth noting that this is another spell that is a divine spell as well, except in the divine spell book, it's in level 3. So wizards have to wait till level 4 to get it, a much more valuable spell slot, arcane level 4 versus priest level 3. Your most typical use case would be if you accidentally equipped a cursed item. In the base game, I can't really think of any enemy that will actually curse you. In SCS, a lot of high-level enemies like golems, etc., will place a curse on you that prevents you from healing. And if you're playing SCS, Remove Curse is a lot more helpful. If you're playing the base game, then it's really only about items. I note that the spell description says that certain special curses may not be countered by this spell, or may be countered only by a caster of a certain level or more. I've never seen that game dynamic ever. I don't know why that's in the description. I don't really think that's an implemented or real game mechanic. I think that this spell actually has a probability of 100 and caster levels don't matter. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I've never seen it work a different way. In summary, this is a spell that in the base game has an extremely limited use case. It can be cast off a scroll. It can be, you can remove a cursed item if you go to a temple, or a level 2 priest spell will do this effect versus a level 4 arcane spell. There's therefore never a reason to take this spell. Worst case, if you didn't want to go to a temple, you didn't have any priest, you didn't have a scroll, you could rest and stock it once and cast it that one time to remove a cursed item. But beyond that, there's really never a reason to take this, although it does do something. So I can't say it's like one of the worst spells in the game or anything. I'll rate this a 2 out of 10. Let's be real. If you're listening to a spell guide this in depth, you pretty much know before you've even identified them just by the item image, whether it's a cursed item or not. We're all smart enough to remember those few items that are cursed and we equipped once when we were 13 and never put on again. So 2 out of 10 for remove curse. Next spell is Secret Word. Secret Word has an instant duration, a cast time of 4, area of effect of 1 creature, can be anybody, and it's a spell protection removal spell with no saving throw. When this spell is cast at a target creature, it will dispel 1 spell protection of 8th level or lower. Spells affected by this are minor spell turning, minor globe of invulnerability, spell immunity, spell deflection, spell turning, and spell shield. The target's magic resistance, if any, does not affect this spell. So I think, we've talked about spell protections of the nature that are listed out in this spell. This is the second anti-spell protection spell in the game after Spell Thrust at level 3. For Spell Thrust, I rated that spell a 3 out of 10, mainly because it only operated on up to level 5 spell protections. So much more limited use cases, given that a lot of the tougher spell protections in the game, like spell deflection, spell turning, are above level 5. Secret Word, on the other hand, debuffs, as the description says, up to level 8 spell protections, even though it's only a level 4 spell. And that makes this a pretty decent spell. As you get into mid and late BG2 and even into SOA and TOB, enemies are using spell turning. In the base game, they're using minor globe a lot, and this spell works against both of those things. In fact, the only spell protections that are not debuffed by Secret Word are Spell Trap, which is a level 9 spell that you won't see until very late in the saga, and Major Globe of Invulnerability, because Major Globe confers immunity to level 5 spells and below, and that actually includes Secret Word, even though Secret Word is an anti-spell protection spell. But there's virtually no enemies in the entire game. I think that includes with SCS. There's almost no enemies that will ever cast Major Globe on themselves. So really, the gap that Secret Word is not going to allow you to debuff in terms of spell protections is Spell Trap. If you're playing SCS, many more mages will use Spell Trap, and so you're going to need higher level anti-spell protection spells than Secret Word. But in the base game, there's hardly any enemies, except for final bosses, basically, the Twisted Rune or Arenicus or Ball Spawn type enemies in TOB. There's very, very few enemies that will use a Spell Trap. So that means that Secret Word is a good anti-mage spell throughout the entire, pretty much the entire base game saga. And even though you see Spell Trap more often in SCS, this spell becomes a lot more useful than in the base game, just because in SCS, enemy spellcasters are way more liberal with their automatic pre-casting of buffs. Almost every mage that you face will have some form of
minor globe or spell turning or spell deflection or spell shield up. And so secret word becomes a lot more useful in SCS. I think when you first get access to level 4 spells, it's hard to take this over Stoneskin, which is much more essential at lower levels when you're not fighting as many mages, or even improved invisibility. But later on in the saga, through mid to end BG2 and all the way through TOB, this is a useful spell if you ever want to hit mages with single target spells, or you don't like using remove magic, so you need to hit them with breaches, and therefore you need to strip their spell protections down. This spell is the bread and butter tool that you will use for that. And I think in most mid to high level mages spell books, you do have some room in level 4 to take a couple of these on yourself or multiple mages in your party, just because it's not like there's a fantastic damage spell that you want to spam out at this level. Once you have your Stoneskin and your improved Invis stocked, then Secret Word is a great candidate for the next spell that you want to be stocking at level 4. So I'm going to rate this spell a 6 out of 10. It's a quality anti-spell protection spell. The only reason that I'm not going to rate this higher is a couple things. First, in the base game, which is what this guide is about, enemy mages really underuse their spell protections, and so it's just of more limited use. In SCS, this spell would be more of like a 7 or even an 8 out of 10 spell, just given how often you face all these spell protections in SCS. The other reason, I think, is because there is this alternate path to facing enemy mages that I talked about a lot at level 3, and I think is pretty damn good if you tend to be over leveled for your place in the saga, and that is simply to use remove magic and AoE damage or physical damage against those mages. If that's your strategy, you never need to worry about dispelling their spell protections, because once you've gotten rid of their resistances through AoE, through remove magic, it doesn't matter how many spell protections they have up, except for minor globe, but you'll see that less frequently. It doesn't matter whether they have spell turning, spell deflection, or spell shield up, at least. You can go right through those with AoE damage. If the enemy has spell immunity or minor globe up, then AoE damage is not going to work even after you've dispelled their resistances, etc. So you're going to need the secret word. But in the base game, enemy mages or spellcasters are extremely rarely using spell immunity. And if they're using minor globe, you can hit them with a over level 3 spell and still kill them through AoE damage that way, once they've been dispelled through remove magic. So Secret Word, all in all, it's a quality spell, very situationally useful as you fight enemy mages, and I'll rate this spell a 6 out of 10. Next up is Spider Spawn. Spider Spawn is a conjuration spell. It has a duration of 6 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 6. And upon casting this spell, the wizard must throw several spider eggs into the air while saying the final command word. The result, that would be cool if you actually got that animation. The result is that the eggs morph into a fully grown spider that will remain under the wizard's telepathic control. The type of spider that appears depends upon the level of the wizard casting the spell. At 7th level, so right when you get to level 4 spells, you get a giant spider. At 9th, a phase spider. And at 12th level and above, a sword spider. When the spell is cast, there's a 20% chance that 2 spiders of the proper type will appear instead of just 1. So just add this on to the list of really bad arcane summoning spells. In fact, we haven't even gotten to a summoning spell that's even close to being good yet in the arcane spell book. Monster Summoning 1 and 2, as we already went over, are horrible. Monster Summoning 1 in particular is one of the worst spells in the entire game for its spell level. And Spider Spawn is another really bad summoning spell. I think that's especially true because The duration here is pretty limited. I'm going to go look at the duration versus monster summoning. So I'm just checking this. Monster summoning has a duration of 3 rounds plus 1 round per level. God, that is horrible. Okay, so Spider Spawn is at least a little bit longer than that at 6 rounds plus 1 round per level. That's still pretty short. I mean, that's going to last you 1 fight when you first get this spell. That's pretty much always going to last you 1 fight. And by the time you get to much higher levels, these things are going to get vaporized by enemy death fogs or AoE damage or just physical damage. Because the core problem with this summon, like almost all of the wizard summons that are really bad, is that spiders have 0 resistances. So they're going to get annihilated pretty quickly in any fight by physical damage, all the fireballs and lightning bolts and everything that's flying around. They're just not going to last very long. I'll go through the specific stats of the spiders you can summon with this. The giant spider is a level 4 creature. It has 35 hit points, 1 APR, 13 THAC0, and does 2 damage per second poison with a save versus death negating. The phase spider, which is the spider that teleports around towards enemies, is a level 5 creature. It has 44 hit points, 2 APR, 12 THAC0, and the same poison effect of 2 damage per second, and a save versus death at -2 negates that poison. And then the most powerful spider you can get here, the sword spider, is also level 5, has 45 hit points, 5 APR, 12 THAC0, and no poison damage. So I think something that jumps out here is, well, first of all, the giant spider is really poor. 1 APR, 35 hit points. That thing's not going to be around for very long, and it's unlikely to do much damage. The sword spider has 5 APR, but without the poison damage, and it only has 1 more hit point and the same THAC0. There's even an argument that the phase spider is actually better. Like, you get a better summons at level 9 versus level 12, because the phase spider is going to teleport to enemies, so probably get a couple of more attacks off anyway, and at least it has this poison attack, which is one of the scariest things about spiders. They can poison you, interrupt spellcasters, etc. The sword spider switches to 5 APR, but no poison damage, and it's going to have to walk over to its enemies. So I don't know. It's debatable whether the creature that you get at 12 is even better than 9. Either way, these things with 35 to 45 hit points and no resistances, they're gonna evaporate pretty quickly in any serious fight. Especially if you try to cast these in BG2 or, God forbid, in Throne of Ball. So there's very little scalability in addition to the spell not being that strong when you first get it. I guess there is some fun stuff you can do if you want to, like cast Immunity Abjuration on yourself, or a Minor Globe on yourself, or Free Action on yourself, and then cast a ton of these different spiders and like throw out a million webs, because spiders, of course, are immune to web and entangle. That could be like a sort of fun way to play. But even when I try to do that, the spiders will die in a couple of hits with their low HP. It never ends up being as fun as I think it's going to be, just because these summons suck so bad. So I'll rate Spider Spawn a 2 out of 10. Can't really see a reason to take it unless you're playing for fun and trying to, fight inside a bunch of webs. Even from a power gaming perspective, that's not very strong. Next spell is Spirit Armor. Spirit Armor has a cast time of 3, a duration of 2 hours. The area of effect is 1 creature, so it can be anybody. And there's the saving throw says special. I think that's because of the effect upon the armor wearing off, which I'll get to in a second. This spell is very similar to the 3rd level spell Ghost Armor, in that it creates a corporeal barrier around the target's body for the duration of the spell. This spell, however, actually taps into the target's life force in order to create the barrier. The armor itself is weightless and does not hinder movement or spell casting at all. The spirit armor does not work cumulatively with any other armor, however. Dexterity bonuses still apply, as well as magic rings and shields. While in effect, the armor class of the recipient will be set to 1, as if she were wearing full plate. Also, due to the magical nature of the spell, she will also receive a +3 bonus to save first spell. There is danger, however, as when the spell runs out, the external portion of the spirit is temporarily lost, inflicting 2d4 points of damage upon the target unless the creature makes a saving throw versus spell. Okay, so this is the last of the mage armor spells after regular way armor at level 1, and then at level 3, I believe it's called ghost armor. And each of the spells gets incrementally stronger. As we talked about, the level 1 armor spell is really bad. It's something you should never take. Shield actually sets your AC lower. The level 3 spell, Ghost Armor, sets your AC to 2, which, as I talked about when I was talking about level 3, that's a 3 AC bonus versus the robes you're going to be using most often, and a 2 AC bonus over shield. Not really worth a level 3 spell slot in my view. And now we get to level 4 and spirit armor, which sets your AC to 1. So 4 points better than Robe of Vecna or Robe of the Archmagi, and 3 points better than a shield spell. In addition, the spirit armor has this +3 bonus to save versus spell, which I'll get into in a little bit. So I think, all things said, this is the only one of the mage armor spells that's really worth considering as a decent spell in my view. The duration is still pretty good. I think it's not as good as the other armor spells, but 2-hour duration is 5 in real life minutes, which is 5 turns or 50 rounds. So that's pretty much as long as you're gonna go between resting, pre-wish. If you're fighting a lot in that time period, it's enough to sort of clear, most of an area in most instances. So this is a pretty decent duration. And very importantly, this can be cast on other party members, unlike the other armor spells. So there's a good case to be made that, actually this spell is better in sort of late BG1 before you have, or mid BG1 maybe, before you have access to a ton of different great armor, before you've created a bunch of Ankeg plates for your party. There's actually something to be said for casting this on party members. You can use it on thieves in your party or mages that aren't wearing the robe of the Archmagi because you only have access to one of them at the time. And this spell could make a big difference for party member AC. Then the other effect, of course, is this +3 bonus to save versus spell. This does stack if you cast the spell multiple times, and given that saves are a d20 concept, that's a 15% bonus to save versus spell. And also, it's worth noting, like improved invisibility, the save versus spell bonus can be very significant because on saving throws, there's no such thing as a critical miss. So if you're at a 4, your save versus spell is 4, which is already quite low, but maybe you've got there through buffs, then you could cast spirit armor on yourself and bring your save versus spell down to 1, which means that now you have a 100% chance to save versus spell, which is quite strong.
Quickly and precisely.
So the protection to save versus spell, which is the most common save type you're going to be undergoing, shouldn't be, undersold. That's a very decent buff, the +3 bonus. Overall, how quality is this? There's definitely situational use in casting it on party members. There's situational use in casting it on yourself. If even after improved invis, you're down to save versus spell of 4 and you want to get that to 100%, there's a case to be made. I think the AC bonus is decent, to think about 3 extra AC versus shield and 4 versus the robe you're going to be wearing. But when you consider that this is in the same spell level as Stoneskin, I'm just always going to take a Stoneskin over a Spirit Armor if I'm worried about physical attacks. Stoneskin is just better in every way by giving a 100% chance to avoid the hit instead of a +3 bonus to AC, which works out to 15% about, because it's a D20 concept. So, in the trade-off between Stoneskin and Spirit Armor, Stoneskin's always going to win. The other problem is that you have improved Invis at this level. So if you're really focused on saves, then improved Invis, which gives you a +4 bonus to all saves, not to mention a +4 bonus to AC, is pretty much always going to be better than Spirit Armor. I think when you break it down, Spirit Armor is only better than either Stoneskin or improved Invis if you're stacking it on top of one of those spells or you're trying to cast it on a party member. So, I think you have to be at a place where you have a lot of level 4 spell slots before Spirit Armor really becomes something that you'd want to stock. You have to be at a place where you already feel like you have plenty of Stoneskins and improved Invis, because this spell does very similar things, just worse. And I don't know what that use case really is. I think by the time you get to that point where you have 5 or 6 level 4 spell slots, you're very, very leveled, and the AC bonus that you're getting from the spell is not that significant. You start to care more about things like Malison or taking a secret word, I think, by the time you get to that point in the game. So I just never find that I have room in my spell book to take this when Stoneskin and improved Invis are both stronger than it. So overall, it's not a bad spell, but this spell is overshadowed by some much more powerful defensive spells that happen to be in the same level. I think if this was a level 5 spell, even one level higher, that probably would be like maybe more of a case to take it, just because your level 5 spell slots, you have a bit more flexibility. You're not boxed out by the fact that Stoneskin and improved Invis are so strong. And if I was a sorcerer, it's worth noting, I would never take this spell. Just because I would be thinking about Malison, Farsight, Secret Word, and of course Stoneskin and improved Invis being the first 2 I would take. By the time I'm at my last level 4 spell selection, maybe I'm taking a Polymorph Other. I'm definitely not focusing on AC or a +3 to saves. I'd rather just rely on Stoneskin and improved Invis for those types of buffs in this level. So in summary, this is a pretty good spell. I think it's overrated when you consider how it stacks up against Stoneskin and improved Invis. In particular, I find, throughout most of the saga, I would much rather have an extra Stoneskin than be stacking this on top of other buffs. So a decent spell, a bit overrated. Utility drops way off through TOB, and I'll rate this spell a 4 out of 10 for Spirit Armor. It is definitely the best of the Mage armor spells, and the only one that's worth taking in my view. It's a 4 out of 10 for Spirit Armor. Okay, next spell. We're finally here. It is Stoneskin. The final boss of all level 4 spells. So Stoneskin has a duration of 12 hours, a very short cast time of 1. The AoE is the caster only, no saving throw given it's a buff. When a wizard casts this powerful spell upon herself, an outer skin of stone will move up from the ground, completely covering her. This skin is of course magical and will hinder the wizard in no way. The effect of this is to protect the wizard from physical attacks such as melee weapons and projectiles. For every 2 levels of the caster, an additional skin is gained upon casting. For example, a 10th level wizard would receive 5 skins, while a 20th level wizard would receive 10. For each skin the wizard possesses, the spell will stop one attack, so a 10th level wizard would be protected from the first 5 attacks made against her, but the 6th would affect her normally. The skins will remain on the wizard until she's affected by a dispel magic, or a breach, or a remove magic, by the way. All of the skins are removed due to physical attacks or the spell duration expires. It is important to note that this will not protect the wizard from any magical attacks. Okay, so somebody decided, I'm pretty sure this must be a Beamdog type innovation, to put the fact that this is a powerful spell right in the first 7 words of the spell description so that everybody understands the spell is good and you should be using it. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything revolutionary when I say that this spell is extremely powerful, to the point of being pretty much busted in BG1 when physical attacks are so important and enemies, don't really use breach and dispel magic against you. This is just an unbelievable spell. It's like so good that it's unfortunate that the game logic has it hard coded that the Stoneskin effect always turns your mages gray, because you're basically going to be looking at gray mages for the entire saga. That's how good this is. It's so good that it's basically essential to have this spell up at all times on your mages. And the fact that Tales of the Sword Coast added this spell as a scroll that you can get 1 scroll of this spell when you go do the cloak quest where you're sent to the Winter Island, and there's a drop. The final wizard there drops this scroll. The accessibility of this in BG1 makes mages and fighter mages like actually the best tanks in BG1 even. Certainly once you get this scroll. I mean, not early, not from very, very early, but after you get Stoneskin in BG1, you can just laugh in the face of most fights, because early on in BG1 all the way through like mid to late BG2, this game is all about physical damage, especially in the base game, non-SCS. And so being immune to physical damage, which this spell makes you, is obviously extremely, extremely powerful. Yeah, what else can you say? This is an awesome spell that's useful throughout the entire saga. Okay, let's get a bit more into the mechanics and how this works, and sort of how I think about the strength of this spell. The duration is 12 hours. That means that this spell will last through rests. Really, the thing that will make this go away is your mage getting hit, not duration. The cast time of 1 is awesome. You can usually cast this live in battle before you take more damage. So this is a great oh shit button when you're surrounded by enemies and you can't run away, or if you're a fighter mage like I mentioned. You start with 3 skins at level 7, and when you first get access to level 4 spells, and then you get 4 at level 8, and so on until you get 10 skins at level 20. So let's think about exactly how powerful this protection is. And to do that, I think we have to think about the fact that the Stoneskin only gets hit once an enemy has made their physical attack against you, so made the attack roll, and if you have a mirror image up, only once that attack has made it through the mirror image. So there's this stacking effect where if you have both Stoneskin and mirror image on, which you should, if you're power gaming as a mage going into battle, then you're going to have 3 levels of protection against physical attacks. First, the enemy has to make their attack roll. Next, the attack has to get through the mirror image. And then last, the attack has to get through the Stoneskin. And only after the attack gets through all 3 of those effects would you take any damage or have a chance of getting your spell interrupted. So let's just take an example here of a level 10 mage and a level 20 mage and see how powerful these stacking effects are for you. So as a mage, you should have decent AC through items and things like shield or blur or improved invis. And let's just say for thought experiment's sake that you're fighting pretty high level enemies who are going to hit you 50% of the time, even though you have low armor class. You have your mirror image up, and to take the level 10 example, at level 10 you get 5 images on your mirror image. So here's a question. How many attacks need to be made against you before both the mirror image and the Stoneskins are removed? So like before you're going to get hit. So we're assuming that every other attack hits you because it's a 50% chance. At level 10, enemies are going to need 10 attacks to get through all the mirrors, and then an incremental 10 attacks to get through all the Stoneskins, considering the 50% hit rate. So that's 20 total attacks before you get hit at all. And here's the beautiful thing about comboing mirror image and Stoneskin. You don't care about the order, and you don't care about the odds on the mirror image, right? Because if the enemy attack gets through the mirror image, i.e. misses one of the images and goes straight to your body, then the Stoneskin's just going to protect you. So all those odds are going to wash out, and in all likelihood, all of the mirror images are going to need to be gone before your Stoneskins are gone. If not, you got some like absurdly bad luck with enemy attacks, like always hitting your actual body versus the images. So the bottom line is, if you're a level 10 mage with mirror image and Stoneskin up, it's probably going to be about 20 attacks before you get hit at all. At level 20, you get 8 images, so it's going to take 16 attacks to get rid of the images, and you get 10 Stoneskins, so 20 attacks for your Stoneskins. That's 36 attacks that need to be made against you as a level 20 mage before you would take any physical damage if you have Stoneskin and mirror image up. 36 attacks. That's actually quite a lot, because as a mage, you can dodge and kite enemies. You're throwing out ranged spells. Like, unless you're a fighter mage, you're not getting attacked multiple times per round as a mage. So when you look at 20 to 36 attacks to harm to do any physical damage to you, that's probably something like at least 4 to 7 rounds in a fight. If you're kiting, it might be more like 5 to 10 rounds of a fight. That's super, super powerful. You compare it to protection from magical weapons, the level 6 spell. That spell is a duration of 4 rounds. If you're stacking mirror image and Stoneskin, almost all the time, like unless you're surrounded by multiple super, super high level enemies that have 5 APR, this combo of mirror image and Stoneskin is going to last you longer than protection from magical weapons. And that's, 1 level 2 and 1 level 4 spell. This is all from a single cast. If you're recasting these spells, like if you're recasting mirror image or Stoneskins on yourself, you can stay completely immune to physical damage for 50 to 100 attacks just by having, a few mirror images and a few Stoneskins. So that's crazy. That's crazy. That's like, guaranteeing you're not going to get hurt by physical damage for an entire fight. So that's just extremely powerful. With this spell with Stoneskin, you can solo BG1, not that like the last portions of BG1 in the base game. Even on insane difficulty, you can solo it pretty easily as a fighter mage, I would say, if you know what you're doing. You can face tank and solo Saravak as a fighter mage in BG1. It's not even that hard to kill him. If you have decently low, if you're pretty leveled, you have decently low THAC0, or you're just throwing magic missiles at him, because that's how long you can stay alive, casting multiple iterations of Stoneskin on yourself. You can just, face Saravak straight up. What else can we say? This is a very powerful spell. You should always have it up on yourself. It completely changes. It represents a huge power spike for your mage, because you're not going to get interrupted by getting hit by physical attacks. You don't have to worry about your low hit points so much anymore. And the stacking effect with mirror image and your AC is just extremely powerful. So this is an essential spell. You want to get it as soon as you can. You want to get that scroll as soon as you can. I think sorcerers, a whole reason that sorcerers are more powerful is because they get access to Stoneskin quicker, and more spell slots to use it quicker than other mages. This is an unbelievably strong spell. So in summary, an essential spell. You always want to have it up. You're probably going to use multiple iterations of it. It's one of those spells that makes mages like better fighters than fighters, because fighters, of course, can never be totally immune to physical damage, and mages can be immune to physical damage through entire fights from level 7 through having access to a couple mirror images and a Stoneskin. So super strong. Probably, something that if the game was remade today would be reconsidered as being imbalanced or too strong. I'll rate this spell a 10 out of 10. So the first spell in the entire Arcane book that I'm rating, the top rating of a 10 out of 10, but this spell really is that busted, and it is super powerful, and you get access to it, and essential through the entire saga. So 10 out of 10 for Stoneskin. Awesome spell. Always going to take up a lot of your level 4 slots throughout the entire saga. Okay. We have 2 spells left in level 4. Neither of them is gonna be able to follow up that banger too well, but we'll go through them quickly. Teleport Field is the next spell. This spell has a cast time of 4, a duration of 1 turn. AoE is a 15-foot radius, no saving throw. The wizard instigates a teleportation effect that randomly teleports all enemies in this area for the duration of the spell. Teleport Field is best used against multiple enemies, serving to confuse them and allowing the wizard to concentrate on activating her defenses. Okay, so this is probably one of those overlooked spells that I never really thought that seriously about, and didn't really use that much. I probably cast this like as much making this guide and testing it out as I ever did in actual runs. And the conclusion I came up with is there's good reasons for that, because this really isn't a great spell. It should be said, there's no save against this, so that's something. It's also party friendly. And what it seems to do in my testing is that it seems to proc once every round. So it'll teleport enemies in the area of effect around 10 times, i.e. once per round for 10 rounds, or for 1 turn. By the way, stacking these doesn't seem to have any effect. Maybe it's just because they all proc at the same time and there's already no save. But if you cast like 3 of these on top of each other, it's not going to cause your enemies to start pinging around 3 times faster. There's only, it'll be the same effect whether it's 1 or 5 on top of each other, which is sort of a bummer, because maybe there'd be something to be said for this spell if you could cast 3 instances and, just send your enemies flying all over the place immediately within the AoE. That would be cool. Like, that's how it should work, but it doesn't. It should be noted, the radius of this is pretty small. That's a big deal, because if enemies are spellcasters or they're using ranged weapons against you, this spell will really do nothing. The teleport effect does not interrupt enemy spellcasting. It doesn't interrupt enemy ranged attacks. So, spellcasters that are casting spells at you from afar, or enemy archers, are going to not be affected. If anything, they're going to become harder for you to hit, because they're going to be moving around and you're going to be chasing them with melee weapons. So this is really only useful against melee enemies. Against ranged enemies and spellcasters, it's sort of like a minor buff for them, actually. Against melee enemies, though, there is There is some benefit. Sometimes the AI will bug out a bit, and the enemy seems to get confused and can't figure out where to go, but there's no guarantees on that. And this ends up against melee enemies sort of looking like the slow spell. It allows you to kite enemies a little bit easier, but less predictable, and there's no AC penalty. On the other hand, there's no save. So, you could argue that Teleport Field is better than slow against melee enemies. It's definitely not better against casters or ranged enemies, but it's that type of spell. I think a major reason why the spell is not very good is that it has this small AoE, and so if you try to, stay outside the area of effect, which you probably want to do as a mage if you're just slinging spells at enemies from afar. It's your best bet. The melee attackers that you're facing will pretty quickly make it out of the AoE, right? They're going to teleport around maybe once or twice, but they're going to be beelining towards you every time. So if they get teleported anywhere on, your half of the sphere of effect of this spell, then they're going to be able to just walk out of the AoE before it procs again. So it's very difficult, unless you actually approach the melee attackers and get inside the sphere with them. It's really difficult to use this spell in a helpful way. And once enemies run outside the AoE, obviously, this was a waste. This has no effect, and you should have used your spell slot on something else. Overall, a kind of fun spell to use against a large group of melee enemies. The fact that there's no save is nice, but I think this is a worse spell than slow or web, given the limited effect it has and the difficulty of actually keeping enemies inside the teleport area. So not a horrible spell, but nothing to write home about either, and you can't really see it taking it over some of the very strong buffs in this level. 3 out of 10 rating for Teleport Field. And here we go. Last spell in level 4 is Wizard Eye. Wizard Eye has a duration of 1 round per level, a very long cast time of 9. I guess AoE special. It's a summon spell. There's no saving throw, of course, being a summon spell. And I'm gonna skip the spell description, and just sort of talk about what this does. I don't think the spell description is super useful. So what this does is summon a floating eye that looks pretty cool, that has vision and can be moved around like the familiar as far away from your mage as you want, and will give you vision of the area around the eye. It has a standard vision radius just like any character in the game. So that's what this does. You can use it to walk through dungeons with a simulacrum or project image or a bunch of summons. You can use it to see other areas of a battlefield, just like Farsight. That's the use case. In principle, that sounds pretty cool. Especially the idea of, I'm just going to have my simulacrum or a planetar go solo this dungeon, and I'll send the Wizard Eye in so I can control the summons through the whole dungeon. It's foolproof strategy. Obviously, that's pretty cheesy. It's probably a less fun way to play the game, but that is theoretically what you would use this for. In practice, I find that never works. And that's because this thing dies to pretty much anything. I think it is invisible. Yeah. I think it is invisible, but that doesn't really help because Dispel, there's just so many things that will get rid of this thing. Dispel or remove magic will dispel it. True Sight will dispel it. It has permanent invisibility, but it has no resistances to AoE, and it actually only has 2 hit points, and it has no resistances to anything and really horrible saves. So any kind of AoE effect is going to catch this thing inside it and kill it. True Sight and Dispel or Remove Magic are also going to kill it. So whenever I use this, I just find that there's some AoE effect, like an enemy fireball or lightning or, whatever, or an enemy has, enemy mages, once you get to a certain point, are all coded to automatically cast True Sight in every battle, or, dispel or remove magic. Like, all these things will get rid of the eye. Once one instance of the summons is dispelled or killed inside the area, you can't create another one in the same area until you rest. So what seems to happen every time I try to use this spell is I cast it, I'm so excited, I cast all my summons or my simulacrum, I'm like ready to go send this thing across the dungeon, and then the first fight it gets into, either my own AoE or an enemy AoE kills it, given it has 2 hit points, bad saves, and no resistances to anything. And then, I've just left all my summons in the middle of the dungeon, can't do anything, can't cast another one of these until I rest in the same area. Big waste of time. So, I don't really like this spell. I think it's overrated. I would always choose Farsight especially because, the real best use case for needing to see away from your own field of vision is for those super tough fights, like against beholders, or, the final fight at the end of TOB where you want to illuminate the whole area. In those situations, the wizard eye would get roasted in 1 second and die. And Farsight is, there's not a drawback of needing to have, Farsight only illuminate one area permanently instead of being able to move around, because for one fight, you know where the fight's going to occur. Farsight is a better choice. So I've just never really, never really found this to be better than Farsight. And usually if I try to use the wizard eye, I'm just setting up frustration for myself because it's going to die in the first fight that it goes into. So I'll rate the wizard eye a 3 out of 10. It's doing something unique with this giving you vision across an entire level, but in practice, I just find that this never works for me. 3 out of 10 rating for wizard eye. Significantly worse than Farsight, in my view. Okay, that's the last level 4 spell. So let's sort of sum up where we got to with this spell level. I made a deliberate effort going through this spell level to sort of avoid classifying spells as just either good or bad, and having a bunch of spells down in rating 3 and 2, and be more true to the fact that you can play this game a variety of ways, and different spells are situationally useful. And that is the case in level 4. There's a bunch of pretty decent situationally useful spells, although overall it's not one of the strongest arcane levels. I think just running through the different ratings at the end of the day, obviously Stoneskin, the first 10 out of 10 spell, I think in the Arcane book, hugely powerful, makes mages better tanks than fighters, makes fighter mages super powerful and more powerful than any fighter by the end of BG1, when you can get access to this, and a spell you'll always want to have up. So 10 out of 10 for Stoneskin. Improved Invis with its 4 bonus to AC, breaking enemy mages, and plus to saves is another fantastic buff. 9 out of 10 for that spell. Minor Globe, I think highly underrated. A great protection against AoE damage through the early part of the saga. 7 out of 10. Malison, an overrated spell, but still decent, especially in TOB once you have Alacrity and can spam it out. Secret Word, a good debuff, debuffing up to level 8 spell protections. Farsight, I think, is really helpful in those super tough battles where you want to see the entire field of play and plan and play strategically by seeing all your enemies. So 5 out of 10 for that. And then the rest of the level, we have some decent spells here that are situationally useful. Spirit Armor, Polymorph Other, Minor Sequencer, Fire Shield Blue. And then down below that, a collection of, bad save verse spell type spells. The very weak Ice Storm, the 1 damage spell on the level that's no good. And then spider spawn and monster summoning to, yet two more poor summon spells to add to the arcane spellbook, which is a lot of those. So that's it for level 4. I'm not sure when I'll get on to level 5. Level 5 is going to take a lot of prep because, level 4, there weren't a whole lot of new concepts. I think it's a pretty straightforward level with Stoneskin and improved Invis being head and shoulders above everything else. Level 5 has a ton of great spells, some different game mechanics to talk about. So that one's probably going to take a little while to work on. And this is already a long video. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for tuning into these. And as always, I always appreciate the comments and feedback. It helps me improve these videos, which I'm really enjoying making. All right, take care.